There was only one cure that could save Arya, her beloved sister. To find him and save her sister's life, she became a mercenary and never parted with her sword. One day she was returning home from a battle with monsters, but in her haste she tripped. Unfortunately, the young lady fell, hit her head hard, and suddenly remembered her past life. In fact, she found herself in a novel she read in her past life. Her younger sister was the main character and the daughter of a fairy. She is the illegitimate daughter of the mad demon Duke Chris, and also the half-sister of the villain who tortured Arya. She didn't want to get involved with the Duke at all, but suddenly, the main character's fatal illness forced her to turn to him. So on the fairy's evening, she went to the man who was far from sympathetic, but he smiled tenderly and said that she should rise. He looked at her intently and said that his daughter should not kneel before anyone, and even the emperor of their country would not dare to force her to bow. The young man said that she was the Duke's daughter and his sister, and she should believe in herself because she was his younger sister. The Duke smiled as he told the young lady that she was his daughter. She was shocked because they suddenly became kind to her. Kashmir felt a warmth she had never experienced before. The Duke, in turn, showered his daughter with expensive gifts. Kashmir was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. She was surprised, because she realized that Duke Chris had become very strange. Sometime later, the young lady froze in place in shock as her sister smashed the wall. Arya spoke with fury, saying that the death of men did not even compare to the tears of her older sister. Kashmir was shocked because the sister who looked like an angel suddenly became a villain. She didn't want anything like that. She had to protect her sister after this book. Countess Freya had to entrust her with this work. Kashmir didn't want to see Arya suffer and endure hardships. Therefore, Kashmir carefully selected candidates to be companions for the young lady. Crown Prince Diego Elias de Helios. Salatin bowed and kissed the girl's hand, but said that she had saved his life, and it was her responsibility. Diego Elias de Helios Salatin looked at her intently and asked with a grin if she had forgotten how they spent that night together. Chief of the Imperial Guardliner cartel, Renoa Einhart, looked at her intently and said that he had admired her for a long time. He asked sheepishly if she couldn't at least pay Tolik some attention to him. Alexander Leonardo Leon Atara, kissing the hand of the young lady, he asked her if she would like to become a queen, and he would then become her king. He smiled and asked if she wanted a king as a dowry. Holy Father Elior Ra looked at her intently and said that people thought he was a holy father who served the sun god, but his goddess was she. Kashmir was shocked as the fish from her little sister's pond ended up in her own land. Kashmir was in shock, wondering if she had gone crazy. After all, Kashmir just wanted to become a swordsman to protect her sister. If the life of an ordinary person is like a well-served table, then her life was like a bowl of all sorts of misfortunes. Unfortunately, she was born on the red light district and grew up without a father. Her childhood was spent poorly in an old house with her mother. When she was only 3 years old, she had a sister. Arya seemed to be surrounded by the grace and love of the whole world from birth, and she, Kashmir, was gifted only with failures and sadness. She didn't want her sister to live the rat-like life she did. In the darkness around her, the sweet child shone like a fairy spring. She was her salvation and light, so the young lady only wanted a better life for her. When she was 7 years old, her mother passed away, leaving behind only an old and cramped house. The fate of children who have lost their patron does not hold anything good. Kashmir worked hard to survive, and when her sister was 8 years old, she became seriously ill. No one knew the cause or how to cure her. Kashmir couldn't lose her sister, as she was the only light in her black and white life. The medicine that could temporarily improve her sister's condition was so rare that it was incredibly expensive, so she worked tirelessly. When she was 10 years old, she first took a sword in her hands. Since then, her life was permeated with the smell of blood. She constantly attacked deadly, dangerous lairs full of monsters. Her swordsmanship skills grew rapidly, and before she knew it, in the blink of an eye, she became famous. She was nicknamed Mira, the swordsman of disaster. That was what she was called in the Empire. But one day, when she was 18 years old, she, having completed an order, as usual, returned home covered in blood. Unfortunately, she twisted her ankle and fell, hitting her head. At that moment, when the pain pierced her head, she probably remembered her life. In her past life, she was an ordinary student at a state university in the military master's department. Unfortunately, she died of a heart attack shortly before she became a professor. She was reincarnated in a novel she read in her past life. But the biggest problem was something else, because her sister, whom she lovingly cared for, turned out to be the main character of the novel. And she turned out to be the daughter of the mad demon Duke Chris, and also the half-sister of the villain, who tormented the main character. Kashmir slowly opened her eyes and realized that she was most likely in a hospital. She didn't know who, but she thanked the person who took him to the hospital. But a moment later, she heard her sister's voice. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to see anyone. She screamed and looked at her sister in surprise. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening, because she knew that her sister was sick and did not understand why she came to her. Kashmir ran quickly to her sister and wrapped her in a blanket, because it was winter, and she was afraid that her sister would catch a cold. Arya looked at her sister closely and asked if she was worried about her. Arya told her sister that she had passed out on the street, but now she was worried about her. Kashmir hesitated and timidly looked away from her. A moment later, she approached her sister and said that she was sick. Arya was shocked by her sister's statement and was very angry. Arya asked her sister with fury if she thought that she was worried about her too. Kashmir backed away because she did not expect this. Arya told her sister that she worked tirelessly but never rested, and she did not listen to her when she asked her to quit. Arya spoke furiously about her sister, saying that she had already told her sister many times that she did not want to be treated. After some time, there was a dead silence in the room. The truth was that she had fought monsters, but she hadn't said anything about it to her sister until now. She knew that sister would say that it was dangerous, and she didn't want her weak sister to worry about her. For her sister's sake, she earned money and did not dare to rest, but it seemed that her sister was very worried about her. Kashmir moved closer to her sister and hugged her tenderly. She gave in with rage, because she knew that she had to save her. She already knew the plot, so the luxurious life was already waiting for them outside the door. Kashmir apologized to her sister and said that she simply did not want to disturb her, but the young lady was furious. Kashmir pretended to be in a lot of pain so as not to embarrass her sister. She has the body of a swordmaster, which is difficult to scratch and can only be slightly shocked. She had a slight headache, but it was nothing serious. She was puzzled, because she understood that all the problems were somewhere else. Unfortunately, she hit her head and suddenly remembered her past life, in which she was reading a novel, in the world she now lived. The main character was born in a poor area and was ill for a long time, and at the age of 15, she fainted on the street. By chance, at that moment, the Countess passed by and saw her. The Countess saved the young hero's life. Arya stayed in the Countess's house and charmed all the inhabitants with her warmth. At the request of the Counts, she became known as Arya Freya. After that, she entered high society, flirted with famous gentlemen at big balls, and saved the world when the time came. In essence, the novel was about social inequality, which was shown through the example of the main character. The heroine had to go through severe trials in order to know herself. Kashmir was furious because she didn't understand why she had to go through all the trials. She didn't understand why her sister had to know herself. A moment later, she remembered one detail and, asking for forgiveness, ran away from her sister. She was puzzled because she realized that she was the main villain of the novel. The villain that the main character will have to face as part of some of the tests. One of the candidates for the gentleman was her half-brother. Kashmir, who lived with the main character on the red light district, one day revealed the secret of her origin and abandoned her sister. She found her father and asked him to accept her as she was his daughter. Although the Duke showed her favor, she was not accepted in society because she was an illegitimate child. Unfortunately, after this, her soul turned black. 10 years later, the young lady saw her sister at one of the receptions. At this time, Arya was already healthy. Kashmir looked at her sister in surprise and bewilderment. But the main character only looked at her sister tenderly and called her in bewilderment. Unlike the older sister, who was left alone after being bullied, Arya became a universally beloved countess and the chosen one of many suitors. And Kashmir was overcome by envy and inferiority complexes. Unfortunately, she became a villain. Kashmir, in turn, understood that she would go crazy if she tormented her beloved sister. She knew that she had no reason to torment her sister, but she is more worried about the twist in the original plot, so she needed to continue her normal life. She knew that until her sister was adopted, she would protect her with her sword. A moment later, she looked into the distance, as she knew that now was the time to become a swordsman of disaster. A few seconds later, she entered the tavern. Everyone looked at her intently and whispered among themselves, as they did not know why she had visited the tavern. She heard people say that she had many imitators, and now all the mercenaries dressed like this. She sighed heavily, knowing that it was just a comfortable outfit. When she became famous, the people who were chasing her were a nuisance to her, and now, even without her disguise, people were mistaken that she was not Mira. The man greeted the mercenary and asked if she had booked a place. Kashmir said she had an appointment with heaven at noon. He looked at her closely and said he understood. He also asked her what she wanted to eat. She answered him in code, and a moment later, he pointed out where she needed to go. While working as a mercenary, she met many strange people, but this client was completely unusual. The man looked after her intently and wished her a good day. She hesitated for a moment as she stood at the door, but she knew that she would succeed today. A moment later, she entered the room and greeted the pontiff. He looked at her intently and said that he was not the pontiff. He asked in surprise. Hadn't he asked her to call him by his nickname before? She looked at him intently and greeted him again, and also addressed him by his nickname. Several times a month, for several years in a row, she met with a strange client. Looking at the client, she asked if everything was okay with him. He sighed heavily and said that in the temple, as always, everything was boring and ordinary. Elle looked closely at the mercenary and said with a smile that he was counting the days until their meeting. He looked at her intently and said that she always made him happy. She looked away from him because she knew that he himself did not understand what he was saying, because every time, hiding his feelings, he said something that could be misinterpreted. A moment later, she threw his order on the table. He looked at the small bag in surprise. A moment later, he smiled and said that she had done a very good job, but he pushed a small envelope towards her. She thanked him and slowly reached for the envelope, but their hands touched. She looked at him intently, and he beamed. Kashmir looked at the priest in bewilderment. She earned money for her sister's treatment. She tried for it, and it was an excessive joy. But she was puzzled that this was not the first time he had personally come to her to hand her an envelope, and this embarrassed her very much. He smiled and always gave her exactly 1,000 gold pieces, even though the price of magical products changes because the value of the raw materials fluctuates. For this amount, she could buy a bottle of potion for her sister. Some time ago, she shouted at the priest that he would go bankrupt if he paid her such sums. She tried to explain to him several times, but all in vain. A moment later, she called him, but again addressed him as a pontiff. But he looked at her intently and said that she should call him Elle. Kashmir looked at the young man and called him by his nickname. He smiled and looked at her. His smile irritated her. Kashmir looked at him intently and said that he had added another 0 to the promised fee. He smiled and asked if that was really true. She was shocked because she knew that this was not a joke, and she would hardly be able to earn this amount even in 6 months. Él sonrió y dijo que no sabía eso, pero era todavía su error, pero ella tenía que aceptar el dinero. She said she couldn't do it because she couldn't accept an undeserved fee. That was her credo. The maximum she could accept without a deal, and with a clear conscience, was 1,000 gold. Elle looked at the young lady intently and said that this was the price of her blood. Kashmir, in turn, looked at him intently and asked him not to fool her, because she was not a player. She sighed heavily and said that she had had enough of his jokes and that the previous payment would suffice. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she couldn't accept it, since he really didn't mean anything bad. Memories of his childhood came flooding back to him, and even then, he didn't understand why she could never accept gratitude. A moment later, he was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. Looking away from the lady, he said he didn't mean anything by it. Kashmir looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that he really had not fooled her. Kashmir said she really hoped that this would not happen again, and she also apologized for being overly emotional. He looked at her intently, and taking her hand, asked if she could call him Elle, because he didn't want anything else. and they met as employer and performer, but she addressed him as a pontiff because they had nothing in common. Elle looked at the young mercenary with tears in his eyes. She was shocked because he was crying, so she shouted that she was wrong and would call him by his nickname from now on. A moment later, they sat quietly, holding hands. She sighed heavily as she realized that he had obviously become too familiar. But she didn't know he would cry, so she thought she must have hurt him. She looked at him intently as he held her hand and did not let go. A moment later, the young man touched her hand tenderly, and she shuddered. He pulled her hand towards his face and tenderly said that she should definitely call him by his nickname, because he really wanted it. She suddenly remembered how they first met and realized that he really did look like an angel, even though he sometimes had a strange look. She kept a clear distance from her clients, but made an exception for one, because, being suspicious, she found out that he was a good, gentle, and affectionate person. Elle looked closely at the mercenary and said that every time he heals her, but she comes back with wounds. Kashmir thought for a moment, as she knew it would be very good if he could heal her sister with his unusual power. Some races, including elves and beasts, humans in general, did not possess divine power. Divine power did not work on mutated humans. Her sister was one of them. She knew that she would be considered a heretic if they found out that the divine power did not work on her. Kashmir thanked the young man for his help. He said he was just expressing his feelings, and so he asked if she didn't want it anymore. She was shocked because his snow-white smile made it impossible to refuse him. A moment later, the young man approached her. She froze for a moment. He said with a gentle smile that you will always wait for the moment when you can take her hand. Unfortunately, she knew that she could not meet anyone good among the saints, and she found herself an outsider. A few years ago, a boy was being bullied at the temple, and she saved him. He had a dull, black-eyed look, but they had a lot in common. She looked intently at the young man. A moment later, she asked her companion if he was in danger. He froze for a moment, but said that he was not. A moment later, he said with a fierce grin that no one in this world dared to threaten him. She froze under his gaze, as it was the first time she had seen such a look. He said that it was late and she must be tired, so he suggested meeting next week. That same day, late at night, a young man knocked on the door and entered His Holiness's room. After bowing, he asked His Holiness if the meeting with the mercenary had gone well, but a moment later, the young man used his magic on him, and he fell to the ground with a crash. He looked at the young man with cold fury and told him to shut his mouth because he was remembering her. Were there myths about the founding of the empire that had been passed down from generation to generation since ancient times? Long ago, the Silver Dragon, possessing the power of purification, he descended to Earth. He cleansed the ruins of the empire, which were tainted by magic. The current temple is a place where people inherited the power of the Silver Dragon. They controlled the divine power, and the most honorable among them was the Holy Father. He always had sky-blue hair, which was passed down from generation to generation. The current Holy Father, Elior Ra. Elior Ra turned around and told the young man that he was bothering him. A moment later, he used his power again, and he began to choke. Elior Ra looked at the man intently and told him to report to him immediately. At the same time, the young lady was slowly returning home. She was very tired. She froze for a moment when she saw her reflection, as her face was pale to the point of fainting from exhaustion. She sighed heavily, as she wanted to see her sister as soon as possible. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone scream. With lightning speed, she hid as if she wanted to scout out the situation. Kashmir noticed from around the corner that the men had surrounded someone. The man at the same time looked closely at everyone and wondered who was behind him. The mercenary asked the young man with a grin if this really bothered him now, since he was going to die today. The young man said with a grin that he shouldn't have asked that, because he didn't know who else wanted to kill him except his dear mother. Kashmir could tell from his conversation that he was an aristocrat. He didn't give off any particular energy and looked like an ordinary person, but she wondered if it was too much money to fight one young man. She knew he would die if she didn't intervene. Kashmir sighed heavily, hoping that her intervention would not be in vain. A moment later, the mercenary jumped on the young man. At the same time, the young man thought for a moment and had already come to terms with his death. But a moment later, the mercenary froze in surprise as he saw someone flying towards him. Everyone was in shock, because they didn't understand who had interfered in their squabble. She looked at the young man intently, as she realized that he did not know the value of human life. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the mercenaries, as she knew that they would soon meet their end. She glanced sideways at the young man, for he looked like a princess in danger. At the same time, the young man, frozen in surprise, stared intently at his savior. The mercenaries looked at the young lady in surprise, but a moment later, they said that she was simply crazy. Kashmir sighed heavily, as she knew they had to get this over with quickly. A moment later, the young lady pulled out an iron pipe from her cloak, and everyone froze in shock. The mercenaries laughed with tears in their eyes and said that she was really crazy, because they did not understand how she was going to fight with just a pipe. But a moment later, the young lady showed what she was capable of. With lightning speed, she knocked out one young man. She looked closely at the small pipe as she grabbed the first thing that came to hand, but noticed that it was a good option. The young man looked at the girl with admiration, as she had a black aura, and he realized that it was Mira herself in front of him. The mercenaries were surprised, because they did not understand what the swordmaster was doing in such a place. Swordmaster was a title given to those worthy of Mother Nature's blessing and the ability to control mana. They went beyond human capabilities with just a ball. The color of the mana changed depending on the person's potential. Kashmir dealt with the mercenaries with lightning speed. Everyone knew that the greater the potential, the darker the color of the aura. She looked at everyone present as she realized that she had knocked everyone out. But a moment later, she turned around as she heard that there was still one left. The man, trembling with fear, said that he would fight her back. He said that he was the best of those who were here. She was taken aback for a moment and froze in surprise. But with lightning speed, she dealt with him and breathed a sigh of relief as she realized that the last one was ready. Kashmir knew perfectly well that it was dangerous to leave them in the city, and so she threw them all into the forest so that they would not cause problems for the villagers. She did enough to keep them from dying, so they could get out on their own later. A moment later, she turned around as the young man asked who she was. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she saved him. She was shocked and did not understand how a person could be so beautiful. She felt the presence of magical energy and looked at him in bewilderment. She noticed that the young man had a ring that hid his true appearance. He was saying in a hurry that she should answer him, but she was approaching him in a hurry. Pulling back his cloak, she noticed that he had a wound on his stomach, quite deep, but he would survive if he healed it in time. A moment later, she hastily bandaged his wound, and he growled in pain. Kashmir looked closely at the young man, because despite his pretty appearance, he held himself well. She wanted to stop the bleeding and leave. She asked if he could move. When there was no answer, she grabbed his cloak and pulled. She looked intently at the young man and said that since things were going this way, he would have to go with her. The young man was taken aback. Sometime later, after a short time, even if they were in the house, she sat him down on the bed with a bang and told him to rest. She looked at him with a smile and called him princess. The young man was surprised. A moment later, she said that he must now undress. The young man walked away from opium because he didn't expect anything like this. She told him that they were in the hospital and that she knew about herbs and could help him. The young man looked at her intently. A moment later, he said that if it weren't for her black aura and lack of height, he would have thought she was Duke Chris. She knew that the Duke had a dark red aura in the original. She asked the young man what he meant by that. He sighed heavily and said that at least he had a reason to save him. The young man looked at her hard and said that she had no reason at all to save him, and that was all he meant. The young man looked at her intently and said that several types of people help him. The people who admired him and desired him the most. People who hated him and waited for him to retreat. He wanted to talk about another guy, but he fell silent. He understood that he could have been saved by a person who wanted something from him, but he saw that she did not belong to any of them because they were strangers. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted from him, because unfortunately, he could not read minds. Kashmir sighed heavily and looked puzzled, but looked at him, as she didn't want anything at all. The young man came even closer to her and said that he was asking again. He wanted to know why she saved him. Kashmir looked at him intently, as she thought he had been lied to his entire life. She knew that whether they were nobles or ordinary people, There would always be idiots among them. She said that she didn't need anything, and also asked what would happen if she changed her mind. He sighed heavily and said that if she was a swordmaster, she could get everything even by threatening him. She said angrily that he was just lucky, because he met a ballmaster who hates the sight of blood, and a moment later threw clothes at him. She looked at him casually and, sighing heavily, said that he should stop chatting and should change his clothes. The young man said that, unfortunately, there is no kindness that does not have to be paid for. He said that she was the Black Queen and the heroes, and he did not believe in their heroes. She said that he might not believe, and she was no hero at all, so she wanted to take care of his needs and affairs. She looked closely at the young man and, dressing him, said that he would stay here until he could walk. A moment later, with lightning speed, she had him put to bed. Kashmir quickly sat on the bed and said that he would believe it when he got home safe and sound. She smiled and said that what she did for him was not heroism, but a simple human act. She smiled a tender smile, looking at the young man, and said that nothing could be more important than Vedic life. Kashmir said that he should not take it to heart and should sleep peacefully. The young man looked at her intently and asked her to tell him her real name. She sighed heavily, as she really couldn't tell him that. She said her name was Shishi and also asked his name. He sighed heavily and said his name was Debutant. She turned away from the young man and smiled shyly, because she didn't think that was his real name. Some time later, they were sleeping quietly in different rooms. The young man slowly opened his eyes as he heard a noise. A moment later, he saw a man kneeling before him and saying that he had come for him. The young man looked closely at His Highness and asked if he was wounded. The prince slowly looked away and noticed that the mercenary was sleeping in the chair. He understood that she was uncomfortable. A moment later, he entered the room. The young man was shocked and tried to stop the prince. He looked at the prince intently and said that they really had to go as there was chaos in the palace. But the prince still slowly picked up the young lady and carried her to the bed. He was surprised because she was light. A few seconds later, he put her to bed. He remembered how she said with a joyful smile that nothing could be more important than human life. Kissing her hand, he said goodbye to her and quietly said that he would miss her. The next day, the young lady woke up with a bang, throwing her blanket away as far as possible. She was shocked because she understood that he knew perfectly well that she was not asleep, but still left quietly. Having collected her thoughts, she nevertheless decided to go to her sister. Sometime later, she came to the house and called her sister. Arya ran up to her sister with a joyful smile and hugged her tightly, and also asked her why she didn't come back in the evening. Kashmir hugging her sister, she asked for forgiveness, as she had urgent business. Kashmir, looking at her sister, she asked if she had eaten, because she wanted her sister to eat well. The lady looked closely at her sister and asked if she had eaten herself. Kashmir hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Arya told her sister that she was constantly worrying about her, but forgetting about herself, she said that she understood that her sister was hiding a lot from her, but she still asked her sister not to keep secrets without a reason. Arya, hugging her sister, said that she was now complaining like a little child. Kashmir, in turn, hid secrets only for the sake of her sister. Hugging her, she said that they would spend today together. Kashmir asked her sister with a smile if it was time for them to take a walk in the city. A moment later, the young lady said with a joyful smile that she was all for it. Sometime later, they were walking around the city. Arya told her sister that no matter how much she was worried about her, the people on their streets were not monsters. Kashmir smiled and told her sister to keep it behind her back, and she would definitely take care of her. The young lady looked at her sister with a happy smile, as she was simply doing something childish. Kashmir looked at her sister closely, because she knew that if she had known that it would make her so happy, they would have gone out into the city more often. Kashmir knew very well that her sister was waiting for her to return home every time, and understood that she was very lonely. She knew she should have been with her sister more often, but she always had an excuse to be absent. It was her sin, and she suffered because of it. She knew that soon her sister would meet their countess, who would cure her, and then she would be happy, because that was what was written in the novel. At the same time, the young lady froze in surprise, as sister hugged her tightly and tenderly. She smiled and told her sister that she was happy already. After a short walk, They went into a cafe and chose what to eat and drink. Kashmir. Looking at her sister, she noticed that she was very beautiful as she studied the menu, but she realized that her clothes had not changed for 3 years and suspected that she was uncomfortable. Kashmir looked at her sister with a smile, as she understood that she needed to buy a few outfits for her sister before she went to the Countess's castle. She knew that before all her savings went to buying medicine for her sister, but she would soon be cured, so she could buy something else. A moment later, the young lady closed the menu with a smile and said that it would only be coffee. Kashmir said she would go and place an order right away, but in turn, she knew that her sister had grown up too quickly. Kashmir was puzzled, as she was in need of money, and this made Arya worry. Kashmir sighed heavily and looked out the window, knowing that she should fool around with her sister more often. But a moment later, she consoled and looked intently into the distance. She was surprised, because she did not understand what kind of scene she was watching. She saw a man forcibly pulling a young lady around the corner. A moment later, the man disappeared from sight along with the woman. Kashmir was burning with anger and fury. She wondered if it was the Imperial fashion to expose herself to danger right before her eyes. A moment later, she returned to her sister and called her. Kashmir smiled and told her sister that she would go out for a few minutes and that she could eat in peace when the order was brought. Arya grabbed her sister's hand and asked her anxiously if she would return quickly, as she was worried that she might be hurt. The young lady looked at her sister with a smile and said that of course she would return safe and sound. Kashmir patted her sister on the head and said that she would be back before she started drinking her coffee. A few seconds later, she flew out into the street and looked around intently, as she did not understand where they had gone. At that time, the young lady was struggling with the man. She was furious because she did not understand how he dared to touch her. The man looked at her with a fierce grin, while pointing his dagger at her. He said hesitantly, with a fierce grin, that she was going to die anyway. Kashmir, standing around the corner, she looked closely at the man, as she wondered if there were drunks on every corner. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she again found herself holding an iron pipe in her hands. At the same time, the young lady was furiously shouting at the man that she would give him as much money as he wanted. He just had to let her go. The man looked away from her, as he realized that she was an aristocrat. He asked if she really thought that everything could be solved with money. He looked at her with a grin and, imagining a knife to her throat, said that this time money would not help her. He said that she should stop all the talking and should follow him, because he wanted to show what happens when someone ignores people. But a moment later, there was a loud ringing and crashing sound, and the man fell to the ground. Kashmir looked at the man with cold fury. At the same time, the young lady copy lived and froze in place. Kashmir approached the young lady and asked if she was okay. The young lady was surprised and could not utter a word. At the same time, the man stood up and angrily asked the mercenary who she was. Kashmir looked at the drunkard with cold fury and said that he was asking such questions as if he himself did not know. The man froze in place from shock and fear. A moment later, the man was taken aback and started shouting at them, as he saw that they were treating the peasants like pigs. He screamed that the girl had been hanging around here all this time and saying that he was dirty. Kashmir looked at the lady and said that she had just bumped into her and asked why she had insulted her. The girl was taken aback and shouted that she had not said that he was dirty. She sighed heavily and said that he was drunk and had hit her shoulder. She asked the mercenary with anger if she would be punished now too. She said that it was he who was mistaken, not her. Kashmir sighed heavily, as she didn't know how to change her position, but she couldn't lose her pride. The man shouted at the mercenary that the girl didn't even think about apologizing. He shouted that the aristocrats thought they were just garbage dogs, so the mercenary had to teach the girl a lesson. He shouted that they were all noble and that he didn't know a word like sorry, and therefore she deserved to be punished. A moment later, Kashmir used her killing power and said that she did not know what kind of abuse he had suffered at the hands of the nobles. She said she didn't know what kind of life he lived and didn't want to know, but she knew that evil cannot be justified by evil. A moment later, the man screamed as the aura choked him. Her aura was not poisonous when it entered a body under the control of a swordmaster, but in the body of an ordinary person, it caused excruciating pain. She was just going to beat him with an iron pipe, but she felt sorry for the pipe that had to beat the pathetic man who was drunk. Kashmir looked at the girl intently and said that she would deal with the man and she could go. The young lady was surprised and, looking at the mercenary, froze in embarrassment, as she shone with femininity and nobility. The lady looked at the mercenary with admiration and asked her name, but to her regret, the truth was completely different. Kashmir wanted the girl to leave quickly and did not understand why she was delaying. A moment later, the young lady cried out that she would like to reward her savior for such a valiant act. Kashmir, looking at the lady, as she realized that she was about to faint. The young lady said her name with all her might, and a moment later she fell to the ground. But before that, she told the mercenary that she could take the reward from the marquise if she decided to. Kashmir was taken aback when she heard Llewellyn's name. Descartes. The Empress of High Society, and also the main villain of Coffee Night, Llewellyn Descartes. Kashmir in turn was shocked. Llewellyn, the youngest daughter of the Marquis. The girl was in love with one of the main characters, Liner Einhart. However, once he realized that he loved Arya, he became a serial villain. The reason the girl fell in love with the man was because he saved her when she was in great trouble. Kashmir knew that the plot had changed again. She was shocked because she realized that he had been watching them the whole time. The young man asked if she was a swordmaster. She was taken aback and asked what was the matter. He looked at her intently and said that he was impressed with her. Liner Cartel Renaud Einhart, a talented candidate for the swordmaster of the future Marquis Fencer. He loved swords, being a knight and the head of the 2nd Imperial Guard. He looked at her intently and said that if she didn't mind, they could talk. The young man reached out to her unsuccessfully. She was in shock because she realized that she had gotten into an unpleasant situation. Liner Cartel Renaud Einhart, popular cavalier in the novel, and in ordinary times he occupied the position of Silent his Mountain King. But when it came to swords, he turned into an explanation machine. On the good side, he was dedicated to his job. On the bad side, he was just a sword maniac. She knew that she was now in the second half of her awakening as a swordmaster, and if she was in that state, she would be able to fix it. Now she was a swordmaster, and he was just a sword expert. She knew that if she needed to, she could hit him and walk away calmly. Kashmir looked at him intently and asked if something had happened. She sighed heavily and said that, as he could see now, she was a little busy. He apologized. But a moment later, he said that he wanted to ask her a few questions, as he was passing by and happened to notice her aura. With burning eyes, he asked Mira if she was the Black Catastrophe. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a question, but was still taken aback. She was puzzled, because now that she was famous, she was recognized by her aura alone. She understood that on the one hand it was good, but she had many enemies, so people began to track her identity. She hid her face and changed her voice with a ring, because her sister's safety depended on her secrecy. She sighed heavily, knowing that she needed to get this over with quickly and leave. She had previously rejected the offer of the Imperial Knights, but the young man had never invited her. She hoped he wasn't offended, so she asked him if he would believe her if she said they weren't that person. He said flatly that he wouldn't believe it. She was furious because she knew that he was already convinced that she was Mira. She said that it was considered impolite to ask something like that without introducing yourself. The young man was taken aback. A moment later, he bowed and introduced himself. She sighed heavily and said that if he was the commander of the knights, then they could be entrusted to him, but her aura was harmful to a lady in a faint. While pulling the man back, she told him that he should be more careful with the attacker and gentler with the victim. The lady knew that, because of her interference, their meeting was ruined. She knew she had to stick to the original. He sighed heavily and said he understood her. A moment later, the young man said that now she should introduce herself. She said that her name was Shishi. Liner looked at her closely and said that it was not true because she had a black aura, although there are enough people with a dark aura. Mira Black Disaster, the only one who has it completely black. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that it was true, and she was a mercenary. She turned around and asked him if he felt better after hearing this. The young man beamed with joy and said that he really, sincerely wanted to know her real name. He asked us if she was calling him. She was shocked, because she knew that he was cold-blooded and a knight, but now he smiled at her with a radiant smile. Kashmir wondered if he was interested in her and not in the art of fencing. She knew that it was very strange. She looked closely at the young man, as she was curious about something about him. It seemed to her that he was already thinking about her personality, but she understood that this simply could not be. Turning around, she asked how he was going to use this information. She also wanted to know if he had been given the task of finding out about Mira. He froze for a moment, as he did not expect such a question. He looked at her intently and said that he was not interested in the black catastrophe, but in her. She looked at him in surprise, because she did not understand why he suddenly had such a face. Looking away from the young man, she asked why he was suddenly interested in her. She knew that this was not the reaction she expected. He looked at her intently and threateningly, told her to answer his question, while he called her true name. She was burning with rage and anger because she did not know who he was. She stared at him for a moment, but a moment later, she pounced on the young man and with cold fury asked him again who he was. She was shocked because he knew who she really was. Presenting the sword to his throat, she said that if he cared about what was on his neck, then he had better answer the question posed. Burning with rage, she asked how he knew her name. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he did not resist, and at the same time, she felt strange feelings. She smelled the rosewood scent that came from Liner. It was painfully familiar, and it seemed to her that she had met him somewhere before. She wondered why it seemed to her that they had already met. She was furious because she was annoyed by the fact that her thoughts were not collected. He apologized and said that he was interested in her as a person, and he accidentally learned about her while studying history. He assured her that no one else knew her real name except him, so she did not need to worry. She looked at him with cold fury and asked if it was so. Removing the sword from the young man's throat, she said that she remembered him. She sighed heavily and said that she very much hoped that he would take the secret of her name with him to the grave. He sighed heavily and agreed with her, but she, in turn, apologized for using the sword, looked at her intently, and said that everything was fine, because it was his fault that he stuck his nose where it didn't belong. As she left, she said that in that case, take care of the rest, Kashmir, rather return to her sister. The young man looked at her closely and said that he had admired her for a long time, because he wanted to become a person like her. Kashmir froze for a moment when she heard his words. She remembered a young boy who said he wanted to be like her. Then he asked her to tell him how she became so strong when they met again. She turned around and looked intently at the young man, because she understood that this simply could not be. She wondered if the one she had saved earlier was Liner. A moment later, she approached the young man and gave him a small handkerchief. She said he still had some blood left, and he should wipe it off. Kashmir looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he was looking at her so intently. She was puzzled, because she did not understand why he had said then that he wanted to be like her. Even if she tried to explain it, only one hypothesis came to mind. She could not say exactly what they were similar to, but they repeated each other's words. Kashmir looked intently at the young man and said that she very much hoped that he would become better than her. Last time she told the boy with a smile that she hoped he would become better than her. He looked at her intently, but said nothing. After saving the young lady and meeting the young knight, a whole week passed, 4 of which she spent exploring Freya's palace. Kashmir was curious if there were any distortions or dark moments that weren't described in the novel, so she visited the Information Bureau to dig around. Their deeds and reputations matched the novel. She knew that her sister and the Countess would meet in less than a week, on a snowy day the day after the Snow Festival began, when the main character was going to the Countess. Snow Festival, a grand festival marking the Imperial winter. A ball was held in the Imperial Palace to mark the end of the year, and colorful street vendors came out on the streets for the common people. The story began when the Countess was returning home after the Snow Festival and accidentally found a young lady who fainted right on the street. But unlike the original, she became a sellsword, and Arya regularly drank healing potions, so she was not even sure that her sister would faint that day. She understood that everything had to go as it did in the original, but she didn't want her sister to put herself in danger. She understood that even if she changed the details in the main thing, she would have to stick to the real story. She had a perfect plan, but she knew that when her sister stabilized and settled in the Countess's castle, she would be left alone. She was puzzled because she understood that she was acting selfishly now, because she needed to be happy. She wanted to let her go for the sake of her sister's happiness. She understood that her sister should be happy, so she wanted her sister to meet many good people, good parents, and live in a place where people like her were not even visible. In this ideal story, she should not interfere with the life of history after she accepted the title of countess. The mercenary with many enemies will only be an obstacle for the young countess. She understood that all she could do was watch her sister from afar and help her from afar if she found herself in danger. She sighed heavily, knowing that this was enough for her. A moment later, she looked into the distance as she realized that her break was over, and it was time for her to get to work. She thought for a moment, as she had once wanted to try working in a team. It cannot be said that she always worked alone, because taming animals was a very difficult task, so it happened that she had to team up with colleagues. But that was a long time ago. Some time later, Kashmir approached the stand where various tasks were hanging. At the same time, the men were wondering who she really was. She looked closely at the ads, because she was looking for the one that would suit her. Rouge Village, Duke Chris's territory, located on the outskirts of the northern part of the country, was constantly plagued by beasts. Kashmir heard that this village was constantly suffering from disasters and food shortages, because it was impossible to farm there due to its proximity to the snowbelt. Looking at the ad, she saw a decent amount of reward, but considering the difficulty of taming winter beasts, it was not enough. She understood that if this were in the world of the labor exchange, such a job would immediately attract complaints. She knew that only the best mercenaries would be able to apply if they responded quickly. She wondered if they simply didn't want to solve the problem, or if this proposal was written by someone who didn't know how the mercenary market worked. Of all the mercenaries, she knew that only the poor would agree to such terribly difficult, low-paying tasks. A moment later, she, a poor mercenary, applied for this task. The man said that he understood everything, and in that case, he would send a telegram, but she needed to leave right now. She was surprised. He said that today is the last day to submit. Besides, the other participants who are participating in this task are leaving soon. He said that the Duke takes his territory very seriously, and several times the support teams sent to the village have been wiped out by beast attacks. So now the support team is entirely composed of knights of noble birth, in and with experience in capturing beasts. She sighed heavily. She knew that the Duke was her father. The man said that since there were mercenaries who participated in capturing the beasts that the village ordered, they would definitely take her along. But he did not expect that anyone would respond to this cheap task, and he was surprised that she agreed. No one knew that she was the Duke's illegitimate child, but it was true that it weighed on her a little. She was in shock, did not understand what to do, because she approached the gate, and it turned out that she was in another world. She was very afraid that she would be kicked out, because she looked like a beggar. Kashmir, of course, knew that the Duke was strong enough to withstand the Imperial palace and temple, but she didn't think that he had such a large mansion. A moment later, she was taken aback and came to her senses, as the knights called her. They looked at her with joy and admiration. They shouted that they had received her application and that it was a great honor for them. The lady looked at them in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was happening. They said that she could not even imagine how grateful they were that she had agreed to help in taming the animals. The knight said with a happy smile that he really wanted to meet her. Kashmir smiled and said that they were working hard, but in turn, she found it strange, since knights usually hated mercenaries. She felt out of place, as she knew that the knights who had received their titles after long training for the sake of honor had previously despised the mercenaries who wielded the sword for money. She looked at them intently and asked in bewilderment where they were heading now. The young men, taken aback, asked if they hadn't told her. The young man smiled and said that they were taking her to the reception room, as the Duke wanted to meet her personally. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly in the waiting room, trembling as she looked at a small cup. She was in shock, because she didn't understand how it all came to this. She understood that a small cup was terribly expensive. She was afraid to even scratch it, so she put it down trembling. Kashmir glanced sideways at the butler. He, in turn, looked at her with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked why the Duke wanted to meet her. He smiled and said that he was just following orders, so he himself didn't know anything. He smiled and said that she was a swordmaster like the Duke, so he thought he was just curious. She was shocked and wondered if the Demon Duke was curious about her. The butler smiled and apologized for the sudden question. He asked if it was possible that among her ancestors there was a member of the Chris family. Kashmir was shocked, as she knew she was close to revealing her identity, but she smiled and said that it was not so, and she was from ordinary people. The butler smiled and said that it was very surprising, because eyes like hers were rare to find. She looked at him in bewilderment, but a moment later she was taken aback as she heard the Duke's voice. The butler looked at the Duke intently and asked him to be polite. Kashmir greeted the Duke with lightning speed as soon as he entered the room, and she also introduced herself. He walked slowly past her and told her that she should get up and sit at the table. A moment later, they were sitting opposite each other, and the butler left them. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the young mercenary. She was puzzled because she wanted to get home quickly, but she knew she had to look at him. He looked at her intently and said that she had beautiful eyes. She looked at him in bewilderment, because the butler had also mentioned her eyes earlier. Trembling, the young lady thanked the Duke for the compliment. She was already tired of hearing about her strange eyes. She wondered if it was sarcasm, or if they were really beautiful. The Duke said that he did not call her for anything unpleasant, so she could relax. She looked at him in surprise, and wondered if the rumors about the Duke were exaggerated. He looked at her intently and said that she was here, so he needed to ask her something. After a few minutes, he asked why she applied for this task. She looked at him in surprise. He asked her if perhaps she did not know how difficult it was to suppress the attacks of beasts. He noticed that the payment was not very generous. Kashmir was surprised, since he understood that the task was not very good, but she saw that his gaze was sincerely inquisitive. He said that he was interested in her because she had agreed to help the village for almost nothing. She was shocked because he knew her, but she was not interested in him because he was her father. He sighed heavily and said that he was not testing her with this question. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked why she was creating problems for herself. Kashmir froze in place and was taken aback by this question. Kashmir sighed heavily and said that she didn't know herself. He looked at her in bewilderment. All this time, the young lady worked hard, became stronger, and when she did, she saw how many weak people there were around. She was very surprised by this fact, but she could not do anything. She saw towns where mercenaries were hired every year to help them survive the winter safely. Kashmir had seen villages where they couldn't afford mercenaries and were constantly cleaning up the bodies of the dead. In this vaunted world, many people were left behind, and she was one of them. She sighed heavily and said that the aristocrats didn't care about them, and perhaps it was because they weren't strong enough to withstand the sight of innocent people's blood. She was responsible for that strength. A moment later, she promised and asked for forgiveness. As she said she was talking nonsense, the Duke looked at her sharply and said that she was not. Kashmir looked at him intently and gave in to questions about whether all of this was sarcasm. Kashmir sat quietly in her place, as she was embarrassed and afraid that she might have crossed the line by blurting out too much. A moment later, the butler knocked on the room and, asking forgiveness for interrupting the conversation, informed the Duke that the knights were ready to leave. Kashmir looked at the Duke with a joyful smile and said that it was time for her to join them. She asked if he would allow her to join. The Duke looked intently at the young rider, but a moment later, he began to remove the ring from her hand. He slowly placed it on the table and said that she should take it. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was giving her the ring. He said that she should understand very well how absurd 100 gold pieces were as a reward for catching animals. The Duke said that this was an additional payment from him. Kashmir, in turn, said that she would only accept the promised money, and nothing more than that. If she remained to live with her sister, then she could think about it. But she knew that her sister would soon become a countess, and she would live alone, and her pride and conscience did not allow her to receive an undeserved reward just to pamper herself. He looked at her closely and said that she was indeed strange. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was obviously so. He looked at her intently and said that there were many people in this world who were unaware of obvious things. A moment later, he said that she could leave, as they had to leave soon. The young lady bowed and thanked him. He looked closely at her trail and wished her luck. The Empire had a founding myth. The sun god saw the chaos on Earth, sent down 3 dragons to calm the continent. One of them, a black dragon with a murderous force, defended the Empire by cutting down the barbarians. But due to the excessive slaughter, the Magi locked his soul and the laser eyes turned scarlet. For that reason, the descendants of the Black Dragon, the direct descendants of Duke Chris, have had scarlet eyes for generations. Unlike the well-known appearance of the Imperial family and the Holy Pope, the distinctive features of the Duke Chris family are only known to the descendants of dragons. The only people with scarlet eyes in the entire empire, only the descendants of the ducal family. The Duke, in turn, was absolutely certain that he saw scarlet eyes behind the mask of the young lady. And this means that the reason why he extended the family ring, the symbol of continuity, was solely out of curiosity about the reaction. He saw that her face bore traces of the storms and hardships of a difficult life, but her eyes were pure and shining. He understood that this looked contradictory. She had a completely different way of thinking, a completely opposite way of life. But nevertheless, she was also a master of the sword and had scarlet eyes. A strange feeling of déjà vu raged within him because he thought about how wonderful and at the same time strange it was. Incredibly simple-minded, naive. But that's why she's so brilliant. Thanks to all this, he only liked her more. He thought for a moment and wondered how he could entice her. Sometime later, the knights gathered. The man looked closely at everyone present and told them how they would move. He said that the number of members in the squad was small, but they had a psionic. So if he sowed discord among the beasts, it would be easier for them. Kashmir looked at them in surprise. She knew that in the original story, there was one character who made everyone fear psionic magic. One of the 5 main characters, a genre destroyer who turned fantasy into a thriller. And every time he gave in to his obsession, the main character suffered terribly. The man looked closely at his watch and said that he would arrive soon. But a moment later, everyone was taken aback as they heard a loud explosion. With lightning speed, all the knights drew their swords, but the man told them to calm down, as this was not an enemy, but a wizard. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the young man, for she knew that he was her half-brother and Duke Chris's first son, Karl Heimad Kaiser Chris. Karl, in turn, slowly approached the young lady and said that he knew that she was short, but she turned out to be even smaller than he thought. He asked if she had not been eating well. She looked at him in surprise, since she did not want to get involved with him at all. A moment later, the young lady smiled and said that it was a great honor to meet him, and she also introduced herself. She said that she was worried about the same things he was, and it was sweet of him. He looked at her intently, but a moment later, he became embarrassed and looked away. As he left, he told everyone present that they needed to move on. She was shocked, wondering if he would really go with them, since she didn't want that at all. Kashmir looked at the young man intently and asked if the journey would be too dangerous for him. He looked at her coldly and asked if she really thought the noble Master Duke would be a burden to her. Kashmir bowed and said that it was not that simple. She was very surprised. She said that she heard he was the greatest magician in the Empire, so she asked him for forgiveness for her insolence. He turned around and said that the village had suffered greatly, and so he wanted to personally assess the damage. She looked after him in surprise and wondered if he was also one of the good aristocrats. A moment later, he pushed her away and told her to get out of the way, but in doing so, he touched her. The young lady, in turn, froze in place. She was puzzled, because she did not understand what it was like, as she felt the warmth that filled her body with energy and lightness. The man smiled and told the young lady that the young wizard had been interested in her for a long time. He said with a smile that light magic was not easy for him, so he tried not to use it. But seeing how he blessed her, it now seemed like he liked her very much. Kashmir stood frozen for a moment, taken aback. She wondered if it was because he was rude and hostile. She doubted that he had not cursed her, but blessed her. After a long journey, they all set up camp as a group. A moment later, a young man approached the young lady and handed her a small bowl of food. Kashmir thanked him with a smile, but a moment later, she looked at the young man in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he sat down next to her. She asked in surprise if he was really going to eat it too. He asked with no less surprise if she really thought he only ate steaks. To be honest, that was exactly what she thought, because the nobles she knew would rather die than eat what the commoners ate. Carl sighed heavily and said that he didn't know what kind of person she imagined him to be, but he wasn't the type to enjoy luxury alone in the middle of a camp. She knew that in the original story, he didn't show any remorse. When she heard that he had joined the expedition, she thought that he would never go to battle, but he had done nothing wrong and did not treat people like the original. He looked at her closely and said that she seemed to have been thinking about something all day. She smiled and asked if it was tasty. Carl looked away and sighed heavily, asking if he really looked like a 5-year-old child. She saw that he looked like a child with whom I was playing. However, he was already 19 years old. In particular, he from the original drove people crazy and was quite strange. But she knew that, for a teenager, this is normal. She smiled and said that she liked it. Kashmir, with a smile, said that if he didn't mind, they could have some fun. She asked if he had any questions he wanted to ask. He sighed heavily and asked why she became a mercenary. She smiled and said that it was all for the money. He looked at her in confusion for a moment, and then she said she just wanted to protect the man she loved, and it was the only way she could make money. It was all just like that, because before she had extended her blood for her sister and lived with her feeling of helplessness and shame, since she could not help her dying sister, and perhaps that is why the name Mira was covered in darkness. He immediately asked her the next question and asked why she became a hero. She looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't intend to become one. It just happened that way. Carl, in turn, wanted to know why she was going out of her way to do something that didn't even cost much money. She was taken aback, because the Duke was asking her the same question as he. Kashmir told the young man that it was because she knew how painful it was to lose loved ones, the countless number of people dying because of animals, and she didn't want to see people lose the ones they loved. He looked at her intently and asked her what life was like with the one she loved so much. She noticed that his voice sounded terribly ignorant to her. She saw that he was very young and did not know what love was. Kashmir said that it is terribly hopeless, difficult, and hard when you lose a person you love. The heart becomes very painful, and then a person begins to regret the existence of this love. But despair makes you love life. Hug your loved ones while they are alive and be happy, no matter what. He looked at her in surprise with a keen gaze. She was taken aback as he frightened her. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had said a lot to him, and she wondered in her mind if she was being too weird. He smiled and said that it was amazing because he also wanted to meet someone special. The next day, the whole group came to the village, and the residents welcomed them. The old man rushed towards the young mercenary, as they were grateful that the group came to their aid. The young lady, in turn, tried to calm the old man down. She looked closely at the knights, as she realized that this was the first time they had seen such a sight, and there was no invasion of demonic beasts in the capital. And for the guys, this was the history of a distant country. A moment later, the young lady looked at the old man closely and introduced herself. She said that she had come with a team of tamers on a mission. After a few seconds, she showed her golden shield. The old man looked at her intently and shook her hand, saying that they were very grateful that the knights had come, as they thought that everyone would die helplessly this winter. But they were glad that the master was here in the village. She smiled tenderly at the old man and said that now they could sleep peacefully because no one else would die. But for an old man who had lived his whole life in the village, the land there was barren and hard, and only small animals attacked them. For this reason, up until now, the villagers had somehow been able to survive. But this winter, something strange happened. The monsters rushed at the people with cold fury, as if maddened by blood. It seemed to the people that the monsters had gone mad. Everyone was shocked, because they didn't expect to hear anything like this. The old man, bursting into tears, continued his story. He sighed heavily and said that a week ago, 3 brothers invaded the village and attacked the villagers. Most of the youth were either killed or seriously injured. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback by shock. De Vera. These are very rare animals endowed with magic. The corpses of dogs that have become undead. They are huge and very aggressive. but the number of individuals is small. She was shocked because she understood that this was simply the atrocity of the magical undead. Sometime after the story, she gathered all the people and pointed them to a safe place. She looked intently into the distance, as she understood that the war that was written about in the original was already approaching. The young lady slowly approached the commander and asked where the gentleman was now. A moment later, she entered the house and looked at the gentleman in surprise. Carl sighed heavily and said that he didn't know things were that bad. He knew there could be beasts here that were capable of destroying humanity, but he couldn't imagine it. She looked at him in surprise, because she did not understand how he, who had lived his whole life only under the sun in the great empire, could know about the existence of shadows. She knelt before him and said that it was not his mistake, because he was still young and had the right not to know something. Kashmir, in turn, was proud that he did not turn a blind eye to this, although he could have done so. She smiled tenderly at him and said that no one blamed him. He sighed heavily and said that if he had known about this situation a little earlier, everything could have been different. She said that doubts are poison, meaningless experiences slowly kill, and what matters is what a person will be like in the future. She smiled and said that ignorance is a sin. A sin, ignorance. She asked him from now on to do everything he could. Kashmir looked at the young man with a gentle smile and said that this would be enough. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought so. She smiled and said that she did. He came closer to her and took her hand. She thought he was already grown up, but it seemed he was actually still very young. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly on the street as a light snow flew past her. A few minutes later, she turned around as a young man approached her and offered her a drink. He looked at her closely and asked if it was okay that she was on guard. Kashmir thanked him for the drink and also said that the swordmaster would not die simply because he did not get enough sleep, and that she would be more useful if she simply kept watch. Carl was unhappy with this statement. He saw that there were a lot of people in the camp, but he did not understand what they were all doing. He sighed heavily and said that he was afraid of the clash with monsters tomorrow. She was shocked, as she did not expect to hear something like that from him. He sighed heavily, and looking at the sky, asked her if she was afraid to collide with them. She looked into the distance with a sad smile and said that she was still scared. Memories suddenly came flooding back to her, and, unfortunately, not very pleasant ones, because of such a skirmish, she lost a dear person. Looking into the distance, the young lady said that there was something she feared more than her own death. She smiled and said that, of course, she was scared, but if it bothered him, then he could say that he was sick and leave. She smiled and said that she was strong and could handle it well herself, so he didn't have to worry. She would finish everything neatly and come back, and he could rest for now. He looked at her intently and in a rude manner said that this was very funny advice. Kashmir looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled and said that he was better now, and it was thanks to her. Kashmir looked at him intently and asked if he was really feeling better. He said with a smile that he was, because he was no longer afraid, because he would be next to her, and she was very strong and could protect him. The next day, they had an encounter with monsters. Carl furiously attacked every monster that came his way. He spared no one, and using his strength, he easily dealt with monsters. The young lady, in turn, also immediately, with the help of her weapon, she dealt with the monsters with lightning speed. Kashmir looked closely at the young man and asked if he was okay. He looked away and said that he was fine. She smiled and said that thanks to his magic, they were able to handle it quickly, and it was just amazing. He looked away sheepishly and said that she shouldn't flatter him. Kashmir. Looking at the young man, she said that he should rest. He sighed and said that if she did not rest, then he would not either. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew he was very stubborn. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she heard something in the distance. Carl looked at her in surprise, as he saw that she was wary. She was shocked because she realized that they were coming. Carl, with his lightning speed, ran up to the young mercenary and asked if everything was okay. It seemed to her that the blood ties really connected them strongly. It had only been a few days since they knew each other, but she didn't want to lose him. Kashmir looked at her brother and asked him to make sure he survived. He looked at her in confusion, as he did not understand what it was saying. A moment later, She scooped him up in her arms and shouted at everyone else to get ready, as a horde of monsters was coming towards them. Kashmir ran hurriedly towards the camp, with the young master on her shoulders. The knights looked at her in surprise and asked if something had happened. She shouted to them that a horde was coming towards them, and they needed to run immediately, because there were at least 40 of them. They were fast and huge, so they needed to use teleportation immediately. She looked closely at everyone present and asked how many people would teleport at once. She was told about 6 people at a time. Carl sighed heavily and, looking at the young mercenary, said that she must first explain where the horde was. Kashmir looked at everyone closely and said that they should listen to the ground, and they would hear the tramp. The young knight slowly accepted, bowed to the ground. A moment later, he was taken aback, as he clearly heard a hum. She was shocked and did not understand why hordes of animals that usually did not leave their habitats were moving straight towards them. Kashmir saw that they had only 14 people, and there would be 2 left. Kashmir looked at the young master intently and asked if he could perform teleportation. He said that he could create a teleportation for 10 people. She was puzzled, because she did not understand what to do, because one person should remain. The young gentleman looked at her intently and said that he would stay here with her. She was taken aback, as were all the other knights. The knight cried out that he could not do it, and the young lady in turn cried out that he must return immediately. She was furious because she knew there was no other way. She knew there should be no more victims. A moment later, she remembered the small artifact that El had once given her. She knew that when she returned, she would have to thank him. A moment later, she walked up to the young master and handed him the artifact, and also said a key phrase. She said that he should just think of the place he wanted to go to, and should remember the key phrase. A few minutes later, she directed her aura at him. He was taken aback, because he did not understand what was happening to him. She told the knights to take the young master with them. Charles was furious. He shouted at them to let him go immediately if they did not want to die for the attempted murder of a nobleman. She looked at him intently and said that he shouldn't argue since he had to come back alive. Looking at all the knights, she said that they had to activate the magic circle within a few minutes. The commander looked closely at the mercenary and asked where she was going. Kashmir, looking at the man, said that she would buy them time, but for now they should go to the village and ask for help. She also said that they should take care of the master. If he was injured, everyone would be severely punished. At the same time, the young master was raging as he did not want to go anywhere. He asked furiously how they dared to treat an aristocrat like that, but a moment later, everyone was taken aback as the ground shook beneath them. Kashmir realized that they were already very close. She was clearly aware of the fact that she could die for attempting to assassinate the aristocrat, but for that, she first needed to return alive. She looked intently at the young master and said that she would leave them. With the speed of lightning, she left, while the young master shouted and called her. Some time later, she climbed a snowy mountain. She clearly heard the roar of animals. They were both alive and dead, with their bodies rotting alive. Devera, hounds from hell itself. She looked at them closely and counted, realizing that there were at least 5 of them. She knew that if there was only one with him, she could deal with them. But the young lady was confused, as she did not understand how she could deal with the horde. She understood that even though she was a swordmaster, she could also die. But if the situation could be changed at the cost of her life, then there was still a chance. She looked at the creatures intently, surrounding herself with her aura. She sighed heavily as she saw them, and knew she had no time to look back. She was shocked, because after the beast's roar, she realized that it was unusual, because it was as if it was controlled by the forces of hell. She was puzzled, because she did not know what to do, but still the lady dodged them with lightning speed. She understood that she would hardly be able to survive, because there was a whole pack against her. Until now, she was not afraid of death, but she really wanted to see her sister, who was dearer to her than anything else in the world. A moment later, she was taken aback as she saw some kind of light. She heard the voice of the young master shouting at her to be careful. A few seconds later, she was in a small dome that blocked her from the beast. She was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as she did not understand what it was in front of her. Carl looked closely at the young huntress and asked if she really wanted to do all this cool stuff alone. Kashmir looked at the young gentleman intently, as she understood that he was simply crazy. She was in shock and asked the gentleman where he came from, and at the same time shouted for him to come back immediately because she intended to cope on her own. Carl sighed heavily and said that she had better worry about herself. She looked at him in surprise, still not understanding what he was talking about. He asked angrily if she really couldn't handle these monsters. She noticed that he was using magic. A moment later, they noticed that the beasts were attacking the dome again. Kashmir told the young master to listen carefully, as the beasts were already being manipulated by someone, so mind control was impossible. Kashmir said that to get rid of it, you need to use fire magic, but the surest way to get rid of them is to make a large wound and put smoldering coals in it to burn the heart. She looked at the young master intently and told him her plan. He said that he could do everything. As she was leaving, she asked him if he had the artifact she had given him earlier. He said that he had the artifact. Kashmir smiled and said that in that case, he should promise to leave this place immediately if she was seriously injured. He was shocked and screamed that he couldn't do it. She screamed furiously that he shouldn't be stubborn, because if he refused now, she would knock him out and send him away by force. She hoped that he would survive. Oh, she looked at him closely and said that he must promise her that. It wasn't because she hated death or because he was the Duke's heir. It was because they were of the same blood, and she hoped he would definitely survive. He sighed heavily and said that he promised her. The young lady stood quietly for a while, concentrating on her strength, but a moment later, the dome collapsed and she rushed into battle. With lightning speed, she gave the command to the young master. Following her command, he used fire magic. The beasts growled wildly as he directed fire magic at them. After this, the young lady rushed towards the creatures with lightning speed as she wanted to finish them off. A moment later, she turned around as the young gentleman shouted that there was a creature behind her. She was taken aback as the beast bit her hand, but she didn't lose her head and dealt with him with lightning speed. She was puzzled because she understood that there was no end to this. Kashmir called out to the young master and asked if he could hold off the creature and buy them some time. A moment later, she concentrated and used the method that was created for Togo to fight multiple enemies at once. Kashmir case to apply the most destructive technique. She quickly used Black Tornado on her enemies. With her power, she was able to quickly deal with all the goods. She noticed that what controlled them had disappeared. She slowly approached the young gentleman and asked if he was okay. Carl sighed heavily and said that he was okay, because they were alive. Carl, puzzled, said that he could not even imagine that he would survive the battle. Not for life, but for death. Kashmir looked intently at the young master and asked if he could go. She slowly approached him and sat down next to him. Carl sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he could not go. She looked at him intently and said that he should rest and she would help him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if her left arm was injured. Kashmir smiled a gentle smile and said that she could carry it with her other hand. Carl smiled and said that in that case he would be glad. He said with a smile that after that they became friends. A moment later, he fell on her, as he no longer had the strength. They sat quietly under the oak tree for a while. She smiled, because she hoped that he would have a good dream. Boring life gray days, his life was repetitive and monotonous. But he had one entertainment: torture, blood, suffering. The mental pain passed down from generation to generation only increased his boredom, and eventually he was put on probation. Sometime later, he sat quietly on the training grounds while the knights were having fun around him. He looked at them in surprise as he heard a noise. Carl slowly approached them and asked what they were looking at so intently. The young people were taken aback, as they did not expect to interest the gentleman with their dialogue. He looked at them intently and said that they should answer what they were looking at so intently. The young knight said that they were watching the video recording of Mira's battle, with the help of a magical device. The young gentleman looked at the knights in surprise, as he did not understand who they were talking about. The knight said with an admiring smile that she was magnificent, and that these videos were very valuable because his father had obtained them with great difficulty. He had given them to him to watch, and later he should return everything back. A moment later, the young gentleman picked up a small stone and said that he would take it to look at it. The young knight was in shock, as he knew that he had to give the stone to his father, but unfortunately, he could not say anything to the young master. Karl froze in surprise when he saw the recording of the battle. The Duke looked closely at his son and said that he had been frequently interested in the mercenary lately. The Duke told his son that if he wanted to find out who the girl really was, they could do so. Karl sighed heavily and said he thought they shouldn't do that. He was just curious about what kind of person she was and how she lived. He didn't want to forcibly find out what she was trying to hide. But after that day, his everyday life remained the same. But life began to return to normal. The only thing that changed was that he became interested in the mercenary. Several years passed, and the butler informed the young master that he had received a letter from the Duke. Karl looked at the man in surprise and asked if something urgent had happened in the family. Karl read the letter and was taken aback, as he did not expect anything like this at all. With lightning speed, he stood up and told the butler to immediately prepare the teleportation device. He read that the mercenary would be participating in the battle with the monsters that were threatening the village. He knew that if he hurried, he would be able to join in. He wanted to meet her right away, because he had been interested in her for a long time, but he was afraid that she might not be as special as he thought. But he knew that he had to accept his fear in order to overcome it. And the only way to solve this problem was to check everything out in person. After teleportation, he immediately saw the mercenary. Looking straight into her eyes, he immediately recognized her. And then he decided that he could not let her go. Sometime later, the young master woke up and saw a small note from the young mercenary. She wrote that she had left him, and the remains of the monsters in the forest seemed quite intact, so she did not demand a fee. She wrote that when he woke up, he should take a bath, because he smelled like rotting corpses. A moment later, the young master called out to the commander in anger. Burning with anger, he told the commander to find the mercenary, and he didn't care what price he had to pay for it. But if he couldn't do it, he had to die, because the young master really wanted to know who she really was. At the same time, the young lady slowly returned to the small house. But when she entered the house, she was taken aback for a moment, because she felt that someone was in the house. After a few seconds, she put her sword down and held it to the unknown visitor's throat. She looked at the man with fury and asked who he was. The young man, in turn, looked intently at the young mercenary. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. A moment later, the young man helped her with her wounds. He also told her that she should move carefully, because the painkillers added to the feeling of fatigue. Kashmir looked at her comrade and thanked him for the treatment. Kashmir looked at him and asked why he was in the hut. Didi smiled and asked if a reason was needed. He said with a playful smile that it was just his feet that brought him to the hut. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was really a sparrow, and this hut was a mill. He smiled and told her that she had told him herself earlier that you don't need a reason to save someone. Kashmir looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. He looked at her with a joyful smile and said that a person is simply drawn to a person for no particular reason. She looked at him in bewilderment, but a moment later said that they could forget about it. He smiled and, looking at his companion, asked if she really didn't want to know who he really was. She sighed heavily and said that he wouldn't tell her that information anyway. Didi smiled and said that if she asked, he could still think about whether to answer or not. Kashmir looked away from him and, sighing heavily, said that it was still clear that he was of noble birth, but she, as he could see, was of peasant origin. She sighed heavily and said that if she had known that he was an aristocrat, she would not have been able to behave like that with him, because she understood that a commoner cannot sit freely in front of an aristocrat, so if she found out who he was, she would have to observe etiquette and not cross the line. She came closer to him and gently brushed his hair away from his face. The young man was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. Kashmir looked at him with a gentle smile and said that, for this reason, it was better that she remained in ignorance. She also told him that they could both not be interested in each other's personalities. She said with a smile that he should remain the same, because then she could see him as he was. A moment later, the young man was taken aback and touched her hand tenderly. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and said that she had a talent for making people feel strange. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected such a thing. Kashmir smiled and, looking at the young man, asked what he meant by strange. He timidly and embarrassedly said that he simply hadn't had enough sleep, and that was why he was talking nonsense. She smiled and said that if that was the case, then he should immediately return and get some proper sleep. But a moment later, she looked out the window and realized that, unfortunately, he would not be able to do this, as there was a severe snowstorm outside. She smiled and said that in that case, he could lie down in the hut and sleep. She sighed heavily and looked away, thinking that she was feeling very dizzy, and most likely it was because of the medicine. Kashmir was puzzled, because it seemed to her that she was drunk. After a while, the young man looked at her with confusion and asked what it was. She sighed heavily and asked what he was worth. She suggested that he go to bed with her soon to get some sleep. He was puzzled by this situation. He looked at the young rider with confusion and asked if they had to sleep in the same bed. As she fell asleep, she asked if he really wanted to freeze to death. She sighed heavily and said that she was sick now, and he was weaker than her anyway, so it would be better to cover up before they both caught a cold. He looked away from her in embarrassment, because he thought that she had really gone crazy. Kashmir looked at him puzzled and said that she was not completely crazy, just a couple of degrees. Drunk on the drugs, she looked closely at the young man and said that he was not at the age to be aroused just because he was in the same bed with a woman. She sighed heavily and said that he should quickly turn off the light and go to bed, but if he did not do this, she would throw him out. Didi, in turn, froze in place from embarrassment. A moment later, he turned off the light and sat timidly on the edge of the bed, sighing heavily. He said that he hated her because he did not understand why she created this situation. She sighed heavily and said that she also hated him, but also said that it was already dark and he should get under the covers. Didi was shocked, because he did not understand how he could sleep in such a situation. Within seconds, she was completely intoxicated by the medicine, and without realizing what she was doing, she grabbed the young man and shouted that he must go to bed immediately. Kashmir looked at him with fury and said that if he did not fall asleep immediately, she would make him do it. A moment later, she plopped down on the bed with her companion, who was flushed with embarrassment. She hugged him tightly and began to breathe hoarsely right into his neck. The young man was very embarrassed by her persistent behavior, but a moment later, he breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled away from him. Didi looked closely at his companion and realized that the medicine had intoxicated her, as it seemed to him that she was a completely different person. But a moment later, the young lady turned to him again and hugged him. He was in shock because he didn't understand what was happening at all. For a moment, he stared quietly but intently at the young mercenary. He heard her purr something to her and wondered if she was talking in her sleep. But a moment later, he nevertheless turned his gaze away from her, as he was very embarrassed by this situation. He sighed heavily and pulled away from her a little, because he knew that there was no other way out. So they slept together all night, as before, only he slept alone. The next day, the young mercenary returned to her sister. Arya, in turn, greeted her sister with a joyful smile as she returned home. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw the state her sister was in. She was alarmed, looked at her and asked what happened to her. Kashmir sighed heavily and said that she was just walking and hit the road and nothing serious happened, and she was fine now. Some time ago, a young lady woke up with a terrible hangover. She opened her eyes and froze for a moment as she saw that she was hugging her companion. She was in shock because the medicine hadn't worked on her. It had worked very strongly, and she was saying all sorts of crazy things, so now she just couldn't get it all out of her head. Kashmir sighed heavily as she felt relieved when she woke up first. She left him a note so she hoped he would figure it out completely. A moment later, the young lady saw her sister's wounded hand and screamed. Kashmir in turn was taken aback as she realized that she had completely forgotten about her own hand, which was wounded. Kashmir looked at her sister with a timid smile and said that she was thinking, and also said that she was back and everything was fine with her. She really hoped that her sister had not managed to notice her wound. Arya looked at her sister intently, but said nothing to her. A moment later, she hugged her sister tightly and welcomed her home with a smile, and she also informed her that she had prepared some food and they should go and have some refreshments. Sometime later, They sat quietly at a table and shared a meal. Arya sat and slowly read the newspaper, but a moment later, she said that the Marchioness was looking for a knight in a black mask. Kashmir, in turn, choked after the words to her sister. She sighed heavily and asked her sister what she was talking about. Arya told the newspaper that there was a rather large advertisement for a person being sought. Kashmir sighed heavily and asked her sister if she could read what exactly was written there. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not difficult for her to do so. She read that about a week ago, the young girl of the Marquise went to the capital, but ran into a drunken passerby and almost got into trouble. But a knight appeared out of nowhere and saved her from danger. The Marquise promised a generous reward to anyone who found this knight, and stated that the knight was wearing a black mask. When the evidence about the voice's small stature and the use of black aura were combined, it turned out that it was the Black Disaster mercenary queen Mira. Kashmir choked, because she realized that she had been identified. The young lady looked at her sister closely and said that if you think about it, it happened on the street next to the cafe where they were, and the date was the same. Kashmir sighed heavily and said that it was very surprising. Arya looked at her sister with a smile and said that she was definitely amazing. Arya looked at her sister intently and, changing her expression, told her that she was kind to the point of idiocy. Kashmir looked at her sister in confusion, as she did not understand what she was talking about. She wondered if her sister wanted to make her laugh, or if there was something she did not know about, but she never received an answer to her questions. That same evening, they sat quietly by the fire and went about their business. Kashmir read in the newspaper that after a successful battle for the throne this fall, Alexander I became ruler, who announced that, since he was young, he would focus on national stability for a while and would send a delegation to the empire this spring. Kashmir looked closely at the small newspaper as she realized that the coronation ceremony had been faster than the original, but she was still aware of the fact that the young man was a candidate for son-in-law. Kashmir was clearly aware of the fact that her sister was wonderful, and only influential people would suit her. She knew that the kingdom was one of the allies of the empire. This country, which had wealth and vast resources, as well as gemstone resources, often had wars due to its close proximity to the heretical northern regions of the continent. The military force was enough to maintain peace. They even called Ataru the Brotherhood of the Empire. But several centuries later, a powerful young king suddenly appeared, who seized the throne with blood and sword. Alexander Leonardo Leon Atara exterminated his brothers and scared off all candidates for the throne, but was kind only to his beloved. Kashmir knew perfectly well that she only needed to push her sister towards the young man. She suddenly thought, and memories of an innocent boy came flooding back to her. She realized that his eyes were very similar, but his hair color and aura were different. Kashmir sighed heavily as she realized that now was not the time for this, because she needed to prepare for war. She knew that the second half of the original was quite tedious. In the original story, the main character goes to war as a healer, but she didn't want her sister to go through such an ordeal. Kashmir understood the fact that she had to do everything in her power to help in the war, because she could not stop it. A moment later, she looked at her sister, who was sleeping quietly in the corner. She saw that her sister looked very tired. Kashmir, in turn, slowly carried her sister into her room and put her to bed. She looked closely at her sister and kissed her tenderly, wishing her good night. Some time later, she was sitting quietly in her small office, writing a letter, but suddenly she heard some noise. Kashmir sat up in fear and horror as she heard a noise coming from her sister's room. With the speed of lightning, she flew into her sister's room and was taken aback for a moment. Kashmir froze in shock as she saw her sister shaking and writhing in bed. She quickly rushed to her sister and began to call her, but the note did not hear. Kashmir was in shock, but at the same time, she was overcome with panic and fear because she did not know what to do with her sister. She lifted her sister and asked her to open her eyes. But at that moment, the young lady realized that her sister was not responding to her requests. Kashmir was confused and didn't understand why everything was going wrong. She understood that her sister had recently taken a magic medicine. Kashmir was furious because she knew she couldn't lose her sister and had to find a way to save her. Essence of the fairy tale forest. Essence is more concentrated than the input of the fairy tale forest, and one portion drunk would be enough for 10 years. However, it takes almost 100 years to make a bottle of magic essence, and unfortunately, the hermit fairies were difficult to deal with. She understood that Arya, a half-blood fairy, needed to take the essence regularly, but unfortunately, since it was hard to come by, they had to drink only the magic water. But these were all temporary measures. Even if a young lady settles in a fairy forest near the healing waters, there will still be restrictions, and in the end, the only way for her to survive in the human world is the essence of coffee. She understood that she needed to quickly find those who kept this essence. Mentally, she went through in her head all the influential people she knew. She was puzzled, because she understood that they had not yet encountered the Countess in particular. Kashmir understood that the Marquise could give her compensation, but she would not be able to give her something so expensive. Einhart would not be able to help her, and even the Holy Father would not be able to help, because the reason for the Holy Father's favor towards her was not at all clear to her. The young lady was furious because she knew that no one would help her. She mentally asked her sister for forgiveness because she could not help her. But a moment later, she was taken aback, and for a moment, she froze in place. Clearing her thoughts, she realized that she could still help her sister, Kashmir. She knew that only the Duke could help her, because he was rich, and he had a good reason to help her. Kashmir hugged her sister, knowing that the Duke was her biological father, so he would be able to help her. She knew it was an easy excuse, just bait for him. But the real goal was to use the name of the mercenary Mira and make a deal with him. Kashmir looked closely at her sister and mentally asked her to hold on with all her might. A few seconds later, she rushed to the Duke's estate. She didn't want to ask for essence, just calling herself the Duke's daughter. She intended to become a loyal swordsman and save her sister. Sometime later, she arrived at the Duke's house. Unfortunately, she was not greeted very warmly there. The knight drew his sword and shouted to her. He was taken aback and froze in place in surprise when he saw the mercenary. He was shocked and did not understand what brought her to them at such a late hour. She sighed heavily and asked them to get out of her way. Drawing her sword, she said that she needed to see the Duke immediately. The knight looked at her intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that entry was prohibited without permission, and even if she was the queen of mercenaries, she was prohibited from entering. He sighed heavily and said that it was already late at night, but if she made an official request tomorrow, he would arrange a meeting with the Duke for her. The young lady looked at him furiously and shouted that she needed to see him immediately. She begged him to let her pass, but also said that if they blocked her way, she would not hold back. The knight sighed heavily and said that in that case they could do nothing, but in turn he asked for forgiveness, because they could not miss her. With the speed of lightning, she threw her blade and launched her aura at the young knights. Using her aura, the young mercenary rose up with ease. The knights were wary and did not shout that she should be more careful, because there was a barrier behind the gate. They shouted and called her, but it was all in vain as she jumped over the barrier with ease. A moment later, she landed on the ground with the same ease, holding her sister in her arms. Looking up, she saw a group of knights. They looked at her intently and pointed their swords at her, telling her that she should put her sword on the ground and surrender. In turn, the young mercenary looked at them with cold fury, and after a few seconds, she threw her aura at them. She managed to distract them for a short time and delay them before running away. With lightning speed, she ran to the main estate. She was furious because she understood that she could not linger any longer. With lightning speed, the young mercenary knocked on the door. She knocked and begged them to open the door. She was furious and begged with all her might to open the door, but it was all in vain. The knight slowly approached the young mercenary and asked him not to do something like that, because she would get into big trouble. She told him with cold fury to leave immediately. A few seconds after she used her power, a terrible explosion occurred. All the servants were shocked by this. A few seconds later, she entered the manor. She looked intently at everyone present and asked to arrange a meeting with the Duke. A moment later, her face changed, and with cold fury, she once again asked for an immediate meeting with the Duke. The butler looked closely at the young mercenary and introduced himself, asking if he could learn her name. A moment later, she introduced herself as a mercenary. The butler looked at her in surprise as he noticed that her voice was different from what he had heard before. He wondered if she had hidden her voice with a voice modulator back then. He sighed heavily and said that it was too late. The young mercenary cried out in tears that they should call the Duke first, and then she would explain everything. The butler sighed heavily and said that it was a bit problematic since the Duke was already asleep now. She asked for forgiveness and came closer to the butler, but looked at him with cold fury and said that she needed him now. The butler glanced sideways at everyone present and asked the young lady to tell him the purpose of her visit, since he would not be able to help her if she showed up like this. She cried and said that her sister was ill, so she begged them to call the Duke. The butler looked at her closely and said that he had previously heard how she had shortened the monsters in the village, and as a token of his gratitude, he could call any municipal healer. Kashmir was furious and shouted that she did not need a healer. She quietly moved away to a corner, because she knew that a simple doctor would not help her. She froze for a moment, because she saw her sister coughing up blood. She got angry about this and shouted for them to call the Duke immediately. The young mercenary screamed furiously and demanded that they call the Duke, but everyone just looked at her in shock. She froze for a moment in shock and wondered what she had been living for all this time. She understood that in her life there was only her beloved sister. She wondered why she should continue her filthy life if her sister was going to die, but she saw that her sister was not dead yet and she had a chance. The young lady was furious, as she knew it was too early for her to give in. She turned with cold fury, looked at the butler, and asked who he served. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. Kashmir. Looking at the man, she asked whom he serves and whose orders he carries out. The man looked at her in bewilderment and said that he had been serving the Duke's family for a long time, and he only carried out the orders of His Excellency, the Duke and his descendants. She looked at him with fury and shouted that in that case he should listen to her. He looked at her with bewilderment because he did not understand what she was talking about. The young mercenary slowly reached for the mask in order to take it off. A moment later, the butler froze in shock. Everyone present was shocked, as they understood that this simply could not happen. The butler looked intently and with surprise at the Dune lady, because he saw Lisa in her. She looked at everyone present and shouted that she was Kashmir Chris and was the Duke's daughter. She looked at the butler with a determined and confident expression and said that he should take her to her father right away. Pointing her sword at him, she said that if he disobeyed, they would all suffer. A moment later, everyone was taken aback as they heard the Duke's voice asking his butler to move out of the way. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and asked if she was his daughter. Kashmir, in turn, looked menacingly at the Duke, but a moment later said that everything was exactly like that. He frowned and looked at her closely, and after a few seconds said that she seemed to resemble him. She was taken aback when he came closer to her. He looked at her closely and realized that she was similar to him and her. The young lady bowed before the young man and begged him to help her just this once. She said that she would give him all her magic, property, and soul. She said that whatever he asked, she would give it to him, but in return, he must help her save the one she loved. He was surprised because even in such a hopeless situation, she firmly begged him. He looked closely at his daughter and noticed that she was very similar to the one who had also begged him to save her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that a few days ago, she came to him as a mercenary. He asked in surprise why she did not tell him anything then, but now came to him with a request. Kashmir said she was an illegitimate child, but the fact that they were blood relatives was not important now. He looked at her in surprise, asked what she was talking about. A moment later, she fell to her knees before the Duke. He always looked at her with skill and asked in what sense. It did not matter. She sighed heavily and, bowing her head before the master, asked him to save her sister. The Duke looked into the distance in bewilderment and saw a young lady lying quietly on the ground. He thought for a moment and said that she did not look like his child at all. Kashmir turned around and stared at her sister, but a moment later, she said that the girl was her half-sister. The Duke looked at his daughter with cold fury and asked why he should save someone who was not even related to him. Kashmir clenching her fists in rage, she said that the thing was that she was his daughter, but she loved her sister immensely, and he could not even imagine how much she loved her. Arya became the only color in her monochrome world. She became the young lady's whole world. Therefore, the young mercenary clearly realized the fact that she had to protect her sister, and she not only had to do it, she was obliged to do it. Kashmir sighed heavily and told the Duke that she knew it was not a good reason for him, so she did not want to ask him for mercy as a relative, but if he still allowed it, she would like to make a deal with him. The Duke looked at his daughter in bewilderment and asked what deal they were talking about. A moment later, the young mercenary said that she was a master swordsman and had spent her entire life with a sword in her hands. She looked at her father intently and said that if he just saved her sister, she would become a loyal swordsman of the Duke's family. Kashmir looked at the Duke seriously as she waited for his answer. He looked at her for a while, but did not answer. A few seconds later, the young lady was taken aback and turned around in a hurry as her sister coughed. She rushed to her sister and, turning around, asked the Duke to help her. In desperation, she cried out to the Duke that if he accepted the offer, she would be entirely at his disposal. Kashmir shouted that her skills were obtained in battles with monsters, but she knows a lot about monsters and beasts, and if he orders, she will be his living shield in battle. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked what she was talking about. He asked if she really wanted to be completely at his disposal, and even with a human shield, she said that everything was right and she would do everything for him. Bowing her head, she said that he must save her sister, and she would do for him whatever he wanted. She said that she would not at all claim to inherit the Duke's name, and if he told her to be a dog, she would be his dog. If he ordered her to die, then she would die. Bursting into tears, she wildly begged him to help her save her sister. The Duke froze in shock as he looked at his daughter, who bowed her head and cried in front of him. Everyone looked at the young lady in horror, and they also awaited the Duke's verdict. The Duke looked at his daughter intently, without saying a word. A moment later, he came closer to her and said that she must get up immediately. She looked at him in bewilderment, but did not answer. The Duke said that his daughter should not kneel before anyone. Even the Emperor would not dare to force her to bow. The young lady was frozen in surprise as she burst into tears as he had just called her daughter. She was shocked and wondered if the cruel Duke had really extended his hand to her and called her daughter. But a moment later, she was taken aback and pulled her hand away, but at the same time asked for forgiveness. Since her hands were now very dirty, the Duke did not answer. But after a few seconds he passed by her. Kashmir looked at the Duke with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he intended to do. The Duke quickly lifted the young lady from the floor and told the butler to take her to a spare room and wake the doctor to examine her. Kashmir rushed to the Duke and said that her sister was not an ordinary peasant, but the Duke did not let her finish and said that her sister was a half-breed fairy. She was surprised, because I did not understand how the Duke knew such a thing. He sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady's trace, said that the aura of fairies was very different from that of humans, so they were easy to distinguish for people like them. The Duke looked closely at his daughter, and said that in such a state the young lady would need an elixir. He also asked her name. She was taken aback and introduced herself. He looked at her with a smile and stroked her head, and also said that she should not worry, but at the same time he called her Kashmir Chris. Froze for a moment in shock. He looked at her intently and said that he would definitely save her sister. She was shocked and wondered why he named her Kashmir Chris. She did not understand why he wanted to acknowledge her as his daughter. Kashmir was very interested, but she did not dare to ask him such a question. For some reason, it seemed to her that she would soon fall into despair. The man, in the last minutes of his life, told the young man that he never considered him his son. He told the young man not to think of him as his father and killed him quickly. The young man looked intently at the fragile man and raised his sword over him. A few seconds later, he struck just one blow and his father died. People called him the crazy devil because he killed his father and became the Duke. He had everything, but at the same time he had nothing, except his scandal and his title. Although his marriage was one of convenience, such a boring life was just one of many. Even after his wife gave birth to his son, he did not expect such a thing as love from life. The existence of a daughter, who came out of nowhere, breathed life into him when he was on the edge. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if she thought he was too frivolous. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such a question. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, wondered how else he could say it so that she would understand. He asked if she would believe him if he said that he had been looking for her for a long time. Kashmir was taken aback for a moment and froze in surprise. She asked in surprise if he knew about her existence. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know where she was or where she lived, but of course he knew about her. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and said that they would discuss everything a little later. He said that she is his daughter and he treats her with warmth, so he is ready to accept her as his daughter into the family. Sometime later, the young lady lay quietly in a warm bed while the doctor examined her. After checking, the doctor said that her condition was now more stable. The energy was absorbed quickly, so if she took a deep breath and woke up, she would continue to live as if nothing had happened. He looked at her closely and said that, nevertheless, she could do with a few weeks' rest. The young lady slowly walked up to her sister and looked at her intently. She burst into tears of joy as she felt relieved that she had managed to save her sister. The Duke looked closely at the butler and told him to tell Maria to clean the next room in a few minutes and bring water from the bathroom there. The butler bowed and said that he would do everything immediately. A moment later, the Duke looked intently at the young lady. For a moment, he looked at his daughter, who could not tear herself away from her sister. Some time later, Mary came into the room and greeted the young lady, as she intended to serve her in the future. Kashmir in turn bowed and introduced herself to the maid, and also said that her master was looking after her. They looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not expect such a thing. Maria looked at the young lady intently, and then knelt down before her and told her to talk to her as she pleased, since she was now her servant. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. Kashmir was taken aback and said that she would feel comfortable doing so, since she should speak more formally with someone older than her. But a moment later, the Duke called her and said that she owed nothing to anyone here, because this was her home. As he left, he said that she would soon get used to it. He also said that the room next to his was hers, and if something happened, she should go straight to him without hesitation. And at the end, he wished her good night. The young lady slowly entered the room and froze, as she was captivated by its beauty. Maria looked at the young lady closely and said that she understood that she had a lot of worries, but the old maid wanted to tell her something, even if it sounded stupid. Maria looked closely at the young lady and said that it was natural for a father to love and care for his children. Kashmir, in turn, looked away from the maid, embarrassed. Maria smiled and asked the mistress if she now wanted to enter the room. Some time later, the young lady entered the huge bath. She was surprised, as she did not expect to see such luxury. Kashmir. Looking at the maid, she asked if she could wash herself. Maria smiled a gentle smile and told the lady not to be shy, because it was customary for ladies from noble families to have maids help them. Maria smiled and told the young lady that if she was embarrassed, she could help her undress. Kashmir looked away from the maid, puzzled and embarrassed, and said that there was no need for that and that she could handle it herself. She was very excited because she understood that standing in front of the maid, she simply had no choice, and she understood that the maid would definitely look at her body, but still she slowly undressed and was taken aback when she heard the maid scream. Kashmir asked for forgiveness because she knew her body was disgusting, so she didn't want outside help. Maria said it wasn't disgusting at all, but her scars looked very painful. Maria was alarmed because she did not understand how the young lady could endure such terrible torment. Kashmir smiled and said that she was a swordsman, and these were simple scars. Maria was shocked and said that this was not so. With tears in her eyes, Maria looked at the young lady and said that there are no simple scars in the world. Kashmir was taken aback for a moment and froze, looking away from her maid. She continued to live as if nothing had happened to her, but she did not remember anything being okay. It hurt every time, and she lived every day with rage, as if she was about to die. She tried to preserve what was dear to her and lived only for the sake of this fragile happiness. Sometime later, she lay quietly in her bed. She sighed heavily because, unfortunately, she did not even remember when she felt safe. Kashmir felt a warm and soft blanket, as if she was floating in the clouds. She really hoped that this dream of complete love would never be interrupted. Some time later, the maid reported that the Duke had given orders for the young lady's dinner. Kashmir was surprised, because she did not expect to see anything like this. He also gave her a note in which he wrote that he thought she would not be able to try all the dishes, so he just picked the best ones. And he also informed her that after the meal, a doctor would examine her. She was in shock, because she did not know who she was to her father. After the meal, she decided to go out into the small garden. Kashmir. Looking around, I noticed that the garden was very beautiful. She looked at the small tree with a smile, because she knew that it would become even more beautiful when the flowers bloomed in the spring. She wondered if she could stay at the estate until spring, the kindness that was bestowed upon her for no reason, as if it were compensation for all those years of suffering. She felt a dual sensation, but in turn, she accepted this kindness. She remembered telling her new acquaintance that he should believe in the kindness of people. Because she always wanted it, she wondered if she was naive enough. She could accept this situation as it was. Even though she never expected such a life, even though such things were simply not for her, she was already in great debt to the Duke, just for saving her sister. But she still understood that she couldn't give in to illusions and dream of a wonderful life, because even if she was driven away tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. But she was still a little puzzled by this situation. Kashmir knew that the most important thing was that her sister continued to receive love and care. Kashmir knew that Arya, the child who was supposed to be a countess and live a happy life, she understood that her sister was just a child who suffered from the mistakes of adults. She understood that everything had to happen exactly like this, but unfortunately, many things did not go as she wanted. Kashmir knew perfectly well that nothing terrible would happen if she returned to this life and lived like a rat, but she could not allow such a life for her sister. She knew that her sister was just a charming child, so the Duke would most likely accept her into the family. She knew that it would be better this way, because she would be able to help the Duke, and so she assumed that her sister would live even happier than with the Count. She knew that this was the only option, and there was no other. A moment later, she was taken aback and stared into the distance. She was surprised because the flowers on the tree bloomed in winter. She wanted very much to try to get up and wondered if she could do it. She looked around to make sure that no one was around. A moment later, she climbed the tree, smiling, thinking that nothing terrible would happen, because there was no one nearby. A few minutes later, the young lady was sitting confidently in the tree. When she was a little child, she loved to climb trees. She remembered her childhood, because she knew that the most fun thing was to hang upside down on your feet. Kashmir happily swung her legs and looked into the distance like a little child. She smiled a playful smile and thought that she should still try to return to her childhood for a moment. Turning over on the tree, she felt free. She smiled, because she had not been so happy for a long time. It seemed to her that she was completely alone, separate from the whole world. Kashmir happily inhaled the scent of flowers in the winter air, and she also saw snowflakes tickling her nose. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze on the tree. She was shocked because she unexpectedly met her brother. Out of surprise, she loosened her grip for a moment, and after a few seconds realized that she was falling to the ground. But she didn't have time to fall to the ground, as the young man caught her. She was taken aback and asked the young gentleman in confusion why he was here, since she had been told that he would return late at night. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had found out something interesting, and it turned out that his half-sister was Mira, the swordsman of disaster. For this reason, he had worked all night long in order to quickly appear at the estate. She was taken aback for a moment, as she remembered that the Carl in the book hated her. She saw that he was different now from the one in the book, but she knew that he could still hate her soon, even if he treated her with kindness. Now, in the future, everything could change. Carl looked at his sister in surprise and asked what had happened to her, as he saw that she had turned pale. She sighed heavily and said that she was just a little cold and therefore would like to return to the castle. Carl looked closely at his sister and timidly asked if she hated him. Kashmir, in turn, froze in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. She looked away from him and asked what he was talking about. Carl asked if that wasn't true, because when she saw him, she immediately turned pale. He turned his sad gaze away from her and said that she had refused his help. He asked if she really hated him that much. The young lady was taken aback and screamed that this was not true at all. He sighed heavily and said that he found out that she was his half-sister. But even so, she didn't call him by his name, so he came to the conclusion that she definitely didn't like him. Carl, looking at his sister, said that when she fought the monsters, she did not listen to him, and when she was asked to return, she went ahead. He asked if she really did not like him, and that is why she wanted to leave without even introducing herself. She said that this is not so. Kashmir shouted hastily that it was true, and she did not hate him at all. He sighed heavily and said sadly that she still had not called him by name. He asked if she was really unhappy that the cowardly nobleman turned out to be her elder brother. She froze for a moment as she saw his smile, but after a few seconds she shouted with embarrassment that she did not hate him at all, and she was very glad that he was her older brother. She looked at the young gentleman intently and said that she was not used to having someone dear to her, and she was not used to dealing with people. For this reason, she was afraid to say something wrong. He froze for a moment, but after a few seconds, he said with a smile that it seemed that his sister Ta was still a coward, but still he said that she should not worry about such trifles, because she had gone too far to make a mistake. Carl asked what he should call her now. Kashmir looked at her brother intently and said that he could call her by her name. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had a nickname. She looked at him in confusion for a moment, and then said that her younger sister calls her Shishi. Carl said that in that case, he would also call her that. Kashmir in turn froze in place from embarrassment and surprise. She sighed heavily and looked away, and only after a few seconds asked her brother if he hated her. She said that she was the illegitimate child of a stranger, and that she came out of nowhere. Kashmir said that she was a mercenary, so she lived her whole life as a commoner. Without looking at her brother, she asked if it wasn't strange that he treated her so well. Carl looked at the young lady intently and said that she should listen to him carefully. He said that she had saved him. She looked up and said she did what she had to. He said that even though she had killed monsters long before, she saved him. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Carl said that no one could underestimate the meaning of her life. He said that he was very proud of her as his sister, because she deserved it. He knelt before her and said that she might not understand, but she had saved his life. She grabbed his hand and pulled him out of the abyss of boredom. He smiled a tender smile and said that his love and respect for her was immeasurable. Carl looked at her intently and told her that she didn't need to worry about why he was so kind to her. Kashmir froze in surprise, as she had not expected to hear anything like that from the young man. She knew that he was truly impossible to understand. Some time later, they walked around the palace, and he slowly told her about all the rooms. After all, Maria had previously told the young gentleman that the Duke had called them, so she asked why the elder brother did not show the young lady where the Duke was. They slowly approached the Duke's office. The young lady stopped for a moment as she heard a familiar voice. Arya looked at the Duke closely and said with a smirk that he could not hurt her, because when she lived and grew up in a back alley, she was much more attentive than others, and, judging by her observations, he could not harm her. Kashmir stood for a moment at the door, wondering if the Duke had been torturing her sister. But in turn, Carl stopped her and said that they could wait a little and eavesdrop on the conversation. The Duke looked at her intently and said that when she spoke of her sister, her look changed. The young lady said that she loved her sister, and she loved her more than anyone else, so he could not harm her. The Duke looked at her in surprise and said that she seemed to be fearless. She looked at him with a grin and, coming closer, said that she was even more confident in her words than he was. Arya looked at the Duke and said that her sister told her that he saved her because they needed the spirit of the forest, and the Duke provided them with a cure. She said that he was known as the Duke of Demon, and she had no connection with him. She did not understand why he saved her. Arya looked coldly at the Duke and said that, from what she had heard, he was her father, but she didn't understand why he hadn't helped her back then, when it was unbearable for her, and now he had suddenly shown up and decided to save them. Arya was furious and did not understand why he suddenly showed interest. She asked if he wanted to use her sister's powers, or if the noble Duke wanted to rob his daughter, who lived in poverty. The Duke looked coldly at the young lady and told her to stop this pointless conversation. The young lady in turn looked at him with her cold fury. He said she had to stop if she wanted to live. and she didn't have to cross the line at all. A moment later, the young lady changed her expression and said that her sister was a person who was sensitive to kindness. Arya told the Duke that if he was kind to them, then there was nothing she could do. She would be open with him. However, if he lost interest and turned away from her sister, then she would personally hurt him very much. Bowing, the young lady told the Duke that she realized she should not have spoken to her savior in that way, and she was very grateful that he had saved her. But after a few minutes, she sighed heavily and informed the Duke that her well-being, or even life, was not as important as her sister's. She said that if he was not sure that he could take care of his daughter to the end, then he should not do favors. She looked at him intently and said threateningly that he himself told her not to cross the line. But still, she said that if her sister suffered because of him, then she would kill him, even if it meant selling her soul to the devil. Carl quietly told his sister that it was very respectful, and he personally wanted to know more about this plan. Kashmir, in turn, could not stand it, and entering the room, called her sister. Arya looked at her sister with a joyful smile. A moment later, she rushed into her sister's arms. Kashmir hugged her sister and asked if she was okay. Lady smiled and said that she was okay and nothing hurt. Kashmir looked at her little sister with a gentle smile and said that she now felt relieved, and also asked her to wait a little. Kashmir quickly approached the Duke and, bowing, asked for forgiveness for her sister's rudeness. She asked the Duke to be merciful and forgive them. She said that if he told her what to do, she would follow his instructions, because she was now completely his. He looked at her intently and said that there was no need for that, because he had already made his decision. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that her younger sister had said not to do favors unless he was prepared to take responsibility for them. He said that he would be responsible until the end, so he asked the young ladies if they would become his daughters. Everyone present froze in shock. Arya sighed heavily and said that this was the greatest shame of her life. But a moment later, she rushed to her sister and said that for her sake she was ready to put up with this, because sister was her only real family. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that she was a real pain in the ass. Kashmir, taken aback, looked at the Duke and then at her sister, Arya. Looking at the Duke, said that she was not a pain in the ass, but simply straightforward. He sighed heavily and agreed with her. But a moment later, he looked closely at his daughter and asked what about her. She sighed heavily and said that she was not an outstanding person, but if he was satisfied that her only skill was swinging a sword, then she would agree to become his daughter. He looked at his daughter in surprise, as he did not expect to see such a face. A moment later, he looked at her with a smile and said that it was a very good decision. He came closer to her and slowly stroked her head and congratulated them on becoming his daughters. A moment later, the young lady approached the Duke's son and greeted him with a joyful smile. He looked at her with a fierce grin and said that it seemed like she always acted like that in front of her sister, but he didn't think she needed to be like that with him, since she already knew his true nature. She smiled and said that if he told her to stop, then she would gladly do just that. Arya looked at the young man and said that maybe he already understood, but she would say again that she was disgusted by both of them. He looked at her predatorily and said that she was disgusted by him as well. Arya looked at Carl intently and said that with Sheshi, he acts differently. Arya looked closely at the young man and said that sister always attracted people. She asked him if he was sure that he wanted happiness for his sister. He said confidently that of course he wanted it. Arya asked the young man if he knew that in order for their sister to be happy, she was needed. He said that even a fool could understand that. She looked at him intently and said with a grin that although it was not the spring to admit it, he was also needed for her happiness. Carl smiled and said that everything was correct, because he was a person dear to Shisha. Arya looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if she really thought it was true. Arya looked intently at the young man and said that Shishi loved her more than anyone in the world. Carl looked at her with a fierce grin and said that they would see if it continued like this. They looked at each other for a while, their gaze fixed on each other. Arya looked at the young man with a smile and said that for the sake of her sister's happiness, they would have to see each other often, even though it was disgusting, and she extended her hand to him as a sign of reconciliation. She smiled and said that they should try to cooperate with each other, but not as brother and sister, but as co-workers. He looked at her hand with cold fury, but a moment later said that everything was right, and for the sake of his sister's happiness, they must do it. With lightning speed, they pulled away from each other. Arya smiled, and as she left, she said that she would leave first so he could be free. He smiled and said goodbye to her, and also said that they would see each other later for dinner. But for now, she could rest. After a few seconds, they turned around, and not each went about his business. But with the speed of lightning, their looks changed, as each of them thought that the other was an unpleasant person. Sometime later, there was a commotion in the young lady's room. The maids surrounded her and offered her various jewels, and they also asked what kind of perfume she wanted to use for her debut. The young lady, in turn, was very tense. From now on, she and her sister had to prepare to close the debut, which would take place in a week. Time was running out, but she knew it was better this way than to debut next year. The Debutant Ball always takes place at the annual Winter Ball. Girls and boys who have turned 15 years old gather, and there their future place in social circles is determined by the success of their debut at the ball. Sometime later, the Countess greeted the young ladies and said that she was responsible for teaching them etiquette. She said that they had a lot to learn, but since time was running out, and they couldn't skip the basics and learn only the bare minimum since their time was limited, they had to study to the maximum, and they had quite intensive lessons. She understood the fact that the etiquette of aristocrats was stuffed with all sorts of details, and as the Countess said, they learned many things in a short time. According to the curriculum, etiquette lessons should take place several hours a day, right up until the Ball of Deputies. There were just a few factors that the Countess couldn't foresee. Arya was the main heroine of this world, who won the status of the Queen of the Nobles. And Kashmir was a swordsman who had perfect control over her body. The Countess looked at the girls with delight, because she was worried that they would not be able to study everything in time, but she understood that at this rate they could learn the art of formal eloquence. She looked at the young lady intently and asked what she would do to anyone who would insult her sister. Kashmir screamed furiously that she would immediately throw a glove in the offender's face and challenge him to a duel. Madame was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. The Countess looked at the young lady and asked what she would do if someone said that her sister was of bad birth. Arya looked at the Countess with a smile, but said, not in a very cultured way, what she would do with the offender. The Countess was shocked, because she heard a walking dictionary of curses. She sighed heavily and said that they should forget about the rest, but she asked them not to swear in front of His Majesty and father. Carl, in turn, came to see his sisters, but in the end he was dying of laughter. With tears in his eyes and a smile, he said that he was very sorry that he could not capture it, because he thought that it could be used as a cure for depression. Arya looked at the young man intently and said that the way her father and brother spoke was beautiful, and she was very sorry that she did not grow up in wealth. He looked at her closely and asked with a smirk, no matter how beautiful she was, could she become a favorite little sister? She looked at him with fury and said that it seemed like Big Brother was in a hurry and forgot to take his manners to my room. Kashmir was shocked because she knew that they were the main characters, but somehow they became sworn enemies. To be honest, she no longer thought about the course of events in the main work. She couldn't change the original, so she had to destroy it. But still, she looked at her family with a tender smile. She knew that the most important thing was that everyone was happy. The maid looked at the young lady with admiration, as she knew that she was her greatest masterpiece in life. The maid told the young mistress that she needed to quickly go down and show everyone her transformation. Kashmir, in turn, said that she was a little shy, but after a little persuasion, she finally agreed. A moment later, the young lady slowly descended and stood frozen in place in admiration. Arya looked at her sister in bewilderment. Kashmir, in turn, was proud of her sister, as she was a beauty. Kashmir was taken aback when she saw the Duke and her brother. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and said that the suit suited her very well. She was embarrassed, looked away, and thanked him for the compliment. Arya sighed and said that it was true, and this was real life, because she told her sister to wear something other than black. Arya was in shock and screamed at her sister to try on something other than her shirt and cloak, telling her to stop doing her ponytail and change her hairstyle. But a moment later, she told her sister that she was beautiful, And with that, she threw herself into her arms. She looked closely at her sister and said with a gentle smile that she actually looked very cool. The Duke looked closely at his daughters and said that he had heard earlier that they were heading to the boutique today. A moment later, he handed her a card and said that it was personalized and they could make all sorts of purchases. He said that if they showed the card, they would have a budget worth an Eastern island. Kashmir was taken aback because she had not expected anything like that. The Duke looked at them intently and, handing over the map, said that they could buy out the entire row of stores. Kashmir was shocked, but not surprised, because she knew that he was a strange man. Sometime later, the young ladies arrived at the boutique. The picture boutique was one of the most famous in the empire. Many could not get in to see her, even with an appointment several months in advance. The young ladies were surprised as they saw that the boutique was empty. Maria smiled and said that it was because the Duke had booked it for today. She said that since his noble circles were all gossiping about them, the Duke was worried that they might face inconvenience. A moment later, the madam greeted the lady and introduced herself with a smile, also informing her that she was the chief designer. The young ladies looked at her intently and said with a smile that they were very pleased to meet the pigs, and they also introduced themselves. Madame Cartin looked at the lady intently, but a moment later she smiled and said that she needed to be measured right away. After taking measurements of the young league, was there any talk of fatigue? The lady smiled and told the girls that they were very different, and they had different tastes in clothes. She spent some time telling them what was in fashion now, and what would definitely set trends in fashion. Kashmir apologized, said that before they start working on the outfits, there were a couple of things she wanted to say. She said that her sister's outfit should be such that it could be worn without a corset, and she would wear a uniform. The madame looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. She knew that her sister was without a corset, and she would look strange in a uniform. But after arriving at the family, she was very worried. She wondered if since she became a duchess, she should stop holding a sword. Wondered if maybe she should stop being a swordsman and become a beautiful flower. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that it was true, and she was his daughter now. But at the same time, she was a commoner who grew up in a dark alley, a swordswoman who was hailed as a disaster by the Black One, so she could do what she wanted, since all of her personalities would always be with her. He sighed heavily and said that he knew what he wanted. Kashmir looked at her father intently and said that she was not going to compromise. She knew that this was just a test. Madame was shocked. She said that the young lady should be in a fancy dress at the ball. Kashmir. She looked at Madame intently and said that she understood everything, but she also asked her if she could look at a small sketch. A moment later, Madame looked at the sketches in surprise, because there was a design for a dress with a shirt-like top. Kashmir said that it was very simple, but had an unusual charm, and it seemed that it was worn by a woman with high intelligence. Madame looked at these sketches in surprise. She understood perfectly well that it was very difficult to make a uniform stylish in order to set fashion in noble society. First of all, you need to stand out and make a noise. The force that controls social circles is fashion. She knew that in order for no one to take their eyes off her sister, she had to make the design very loud. Kashmir knew she couldn't disappear like the original. The madam looked intently at the young lady, and with lightning speed cried out that the outfit they had given away would definitely become popular among the youth. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she wanted to make a business deal there. Kashmir, in turn, was very happy, because she understood that everything was going according to her plan, and Madame was caught like a fish on a hook. Some time later, they were returning home. To the estate from the boutique, Arya looked closely at her sister and asked with admiration how she came up with this idea. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Unfortunately, she couldn't say that it was popular in her past life. Kashmir, puzzled, said that it just came to her mind. The young lady told her sister with admiration that they would look good together in something like this. She told her sister, with a smile, that she was really stunning. Kashmir looked at her sister closely and asked with a smile if she was interested in anything else. She remembered the original, so she understood everything that had happened in the last few days. She thought that most likely her sister was still in shock. After all, they became the Duke's daughters in just a day. The young lady smiled and told her sister that she would like to ask her some questions. Kashmir smiled and told her sister that, of course, she could ask anything. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the doctor had previously told her that she was half fairy. Arya looked at her sister closely and asked how long ago. Kashmir took her sister's hand with a smile and said that she had only recently found out about this. When she became a swordsman, she felt that her sister was different from others. Even though her sister was the daughter of the fairy king, she didn't only have the blood of his race flowing through her. She knew that her aura was different from that of an ordinary person. At first, she thought her sister was special, but after she remembered her past life, she realized that the main character was half fairy. Kashmir was well aware of the fact that if she said that she had known about this for a long time, there would be difficulties. Arya looked at her sister intently and asked if she was the swordsman of the world disaster. Kashmir sighed heavily, as she knew that her sister already knew. In fact, she never thought of her sister as stupid. Every day she came back tattered. Her sister remembered this, and also remembered what she had only seen once in childhood. Kashmir supposed that it was incredibly difficult for her sister to pretend that she knew nothing. Kashmir looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that it was hard not to guess that she was a mercenary, but she was surprised, because she did not understand how her sister understood that she was Mira. Lady smiled and told her sister that several years ago she fell ill from the bite of a poisonous snake. She said that's when she saw the warrant with Mira's name on it. Arya told her sister that she knew she was a sellsword the moment she became one. Kashmir, in turn, sadly looked away from her sister. The young lady looked at her sister and said with a smile that she would like to ask her one last question. Arya looked at her sister with a tender smile and asked if she still loved her. Kashmir was shocked by the question because she did not understand why her sister asked such a thing. She hugged her sister tightly and said that of course she would love her forever. She was the beginning and the end of her life. The Duke looked at his daughter in surprise and asked if she had made a deal with Carton regarding the design of the outfit. Kashmir said that it was true, and she would take care of everything, so he didn't need to worry. He looked at her closely and asked if she was sure she could handle it, as it was not that easy. She smiled and said that she had experience in handling byproducts, but she would still trust the matter to a reliable person. He sighed heavily and agreed with her, and also said that they should give it their all, because he felt sorry to miss such an opportunity. He looked at his daughter in surprise and asked what was wrong with her. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if he didn't mind. Could he and Carl try them on for the ball? He looked at her in surprise, as he hadn't expected anything like that. She was delighted and wanted to say that if he wore a suit to the Debutant ball, it would serve as good advertising. She sighed heavily, as she knew that she shouldn't say that, and in turn, she sheepishly said that she would like them to try on the outfits. He smiled and said that of course they would do it, because it was not difficult, and in that case, he would ask his son to do it. And if he said that it was she who asked for it, then Carl would undoubtedly agree. She smiled and thanked him. He looked at her intently and with a predatory smile said that he had one condition, and from now on, she had to call him Daddy. After his words, the young lady froze in place from shock and surprise. He looked at her with a predatory grin and asked if she really wouldn't do it. She was taken aback and trembled like a little rabbit. He said with a smile that she should try. A moment later, she sheepishly called him father. He stood up and, stroking her head, said that this would do for now. As he left, he said with a smile that they needed to take small steps. The Duke said he would be waiting for her with impatience. She looked after him intently as she was embarrassed. Although she couldn't understand him, she considered him a strange person. Kashmir knew that to some extent she was wrong. Now she had no doubt that her father was an incredibly caring person. At the same time, the Duke was slowly returning to his office with a satisfied smile as they had advanced in their relationship. Some time later, there was a commotion in the palace as everyone was preparing for the upcoming ball. They looked intently at the young lady as they believed that she would be the star at the ball. After trying on the dress, the Duke looked closely at his daughter and said that the outfit was too provocative. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that he did not think that the outfit would look so tempting, and she had better change as soon as possible. Carl looked closely at his sister and said that he agreed with his father, as she looked cool. but she stood out too much. She froze in shock on the spot and wondered who was the most striking and seductive of them all. Arya, in turn, looked closely at the men and asked with fury what they were saying, because sister looked cool. But at the same time, she did not say these words in a very flattering way, and she also told her sister not to think about changing clothes. Kashmir turned around to look at her sister's outfit, but a moment later, she froze at the dazzling beauty of her sister, as the outfit suited her very well. Arya sheepishly told her sister that after seeing her so beautiful, she could die in peace. She screamed about her sister that her father and brother were just idiots, and she shouldn't listen to them. Kashmir, in turn, understood perfectly well that these idiots and their family. The young lady screamed about her sister that she was amazing. Kashmir looked at her sister with a happy smile and said that she was magnificent and would be the center of attention. The Duke sighed heavily and said that since they were already assembled, they needed to set out. At the same time, everyone at the reception was discussing this situation, since they knew that the Duke had adopted daughters. The young men discussed the situation because they knew that the girls were commoners, and they hoped that they were not devoid of manners. But they did not understand what the Duke was thinking when he decided to adopt them. A moment later, everyone turned around as they were informed that the Duke had arrived with his son and daughters. A few minutes later, Arya entered the hall, accompanied by Carl. A moment later, Madame turned around and froze for a moment as she was blinded by the beauty of the young people. They were shocked because they could not take their eyes off the Duke and his daughter, and, whispering in surprise, wondered if the young lady was really wearing a uniform. They were all impressed by her outfit, as well as the straps that wrapped her. The young lady in turn was glad that everything was going according to her plan. She noticed that everyone was doing what they were talking about her. Sometime later, she stood quietly and drank alcohol with her brother, Carl. Looking at his sister, said that if something happens, she should cover herself with her family name, but in extreme cases, she should use a sword. Kashmir looked at her brother intently, as she expected nothing less from him. She was a little puzzled as they dared to bring a sword into the ballroom of the royal castle. A moment later, the servant bowed and told the Duke that His Majesty was calling him. The Duke, in turn, looked at the man with bewilderment and cursed loudly. Carl and Arya held back their laughter, looking at the Duke. He sighed heavily and told his daughter that he couldn't be with her at the ball, but he still asked her for forgiveness. She smiled and said that she would be fine, and he shouldn't worry, and she also wished him good luck. Carl looked closely at his sister and said with a smile that he would always be there for her. A moment later, young people ran up to them, and with a smile, asked Carl for permission to introduce themselves. He looked at them with cold fury and told them not to rush to him. Kashmir looked at her brother and called him. He looked at the young people with a smile and introduced his sisters to them. The man looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that he would like to ask where they bought these black accessories, because they looked harmonious on the young people. Carl and Kashmir looked at each other, and with the help of magic, he asked his sister what he should do. She said that the young men had approached them themselves, and so he should be kind and advertise her product. He said that he would do it, but in return, she should promise to show her sword. She looked at him in bewilderment, but said that she would do it, because it was not difficult. Carl looked at the young people intently and said that he would tell them everything now, so first they should sit down somewhere. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily as she was glad that they were finally gone. Kashmir looked at her sister with a smile as she wanted to cheer her up. Arya said with sadness in her voice that she would like to stay with her longer, but it seemed that everyone was waiting for her. She looked at her sister intently and said menacingly that she would make sure that they would be at her feet. Kashmir looked at her sister in surprise, but did not really answer. A moment later, she said goodbye to her sister, as she was confused because she was left alone. She sighed heavily, as she knew she had to do something, but a moment later, she heard someone greet her. The young ladies came closer to her and greeted her with smiles, looking into her eyes. Kashmir looked at the girls intently, as she understood that her time had already come. Initially, she hoped that they approached her with good intentions. Kashmir looked at the girls intently and said with a smile that it was nice to meet them, and also asked if she could know their names. She knew that there was no turning back. The young lady looked at her intently and introduced herself and all her friends. Kashmir thought for a moment, as she remembered the moralizing of her etiquette teacher. But she knew that the Countess did not need to worry, as she would not let herself be offended. She looked at them with a smile and said that it was a great honor for her to meet them. Lily told Lady with a smirk that she looked very peculiar. They said that the black uniform was something new. Even at the ball in this clothes, she looked very modest. She sighed heavily, because she understood that it would be better if they insulted her directly, rather than hinting. She smiled and said that she didn't even know where to go from so many compliments. Kashmir said with a smile that she liked wearing the uniform because she wielded a sword. They were taken aback and looked at her with smirks. They were shocked and shouted at her that in the Empire, girls were not supposed to hold a sword. They said that she was of low birth, and she knew little about the principles of a true lady. But since they were older, they could help her, they said, looking at her hands, that it seemed like she worked very hard. But still, she needed to take care of her hands. Lily said with a smirk that she couldn't even believe that the young lady owned a sword. She didn't know if it would be a disgrace to the Duke. Kashmir looked at the ladies and called out to them menacingly. Kashmir glared at the young ladies and said that they were talking too much. She sighed heavily and wondered if she had crossed the line. The young ladies were taken aback and froze in place in surprise. Kashmir looked at the lady and asked if the name of the Duke was so insignificant to them that they would mention it without any reason. The lady was taken aback and said that it was not so. Kashmir said that the Chris family consisted of swordsmen who had protected the Empire for a long time. She said that for her, as a member of the family, it was natural to wield a sword. Kashmir asked if they had decided to insult the history of her family. She said that she was a lady, but first of all, she was from the Chris family, and they should know that if they insulted her, then they insulted the Duke as well. The ladies were shocked and stood frozen in place in surprise. She sighed heavily and said that they said such things, and it just seemed to her that they were mired in stereotypes. Kashmir sighed heavily, as she knew that male supremacy still reigned in your empire. In recent times, women have become rulers, and often become knights. A moment later, a young lady approached them and told the others to stop talking nonsense, because instead of helping the newly debuted lady, they were trying to assert themselves. Kashmir, in turn, was taken aback as she heard a familiar voice. She froze in surprise when she saw the Marquise. Llewellyn looked at everyone intently and said that their society was rapidly going downhill. Llewellyn looked at the young lady closely and said that she must know Mira, since she had just heard them mention the Duke. Llewellyn asked the girl if she really wanted to make things that much worse. Llewellyn looked at everyone present and said that, as young Lady Chris had said earlier, they should have known by now that the Chris name was not to be mentioned so lightly. Llewellyn told the ladies to apologize before the situation got worse and before the incident reached the Duke's ears. Kashmir looked intently at the Marquise, as she did not expect anything else from her, because the socialite was in no way comparable to cockroaches. A moment later, the young lady approached Kashmir and asked for forgiveness, saying that she was wrong. Kashmir sighed heavily and said that it was okay, because everyone makes mistakes. But a moment later, she changed her face, and looking at the young lady with a stern, intent gaze, said that she should not forget her words, because the mouth is the source of trouble, and the tongue is the sword that wounds them. The young ladies froze for a moment, unable to move, as they were disgraced. But after a while, they left with their lightning speed. Kashmir, in turn, approached the young lady and thanked her for her help. Llewellyn looked away from the young lady and told her not to misunderstand her, as it was not her fault at all. She simply did not want to see high society go downhill. Kashmir. With a smile, she thanked the young lady again, although it was late, but she wanted to introduce herself, so she said her name with a smile. The young lady, in turn, looked at her new acquaintance with embarrassment and, in accordance with etiquette, introduced herself. The young lady looked at her interlocutor intently and asked if they hadn't met before. Kashmir was taken aback for a moment and froze. She timidly asked the young lady if this was possible. Llewellyn, in turn, said that she thought they had seen each other somewhere. The young lady was taken aback and said that this definitely had not happened. A moment later, they turned around, as everyone was informed that the emperor had arrived, with the empress, as well as the crown prince and second prince. Everyone turned around and looked at the young ladies. All present bowed politely and greeted the son of the empire. The emperor looked at everyone present and said that he had nothing special to say. They should just enjoy the banquet. She knew that in the novel, the emperor was 50 years old, but he looked very young. She knew he was a rather strange man, but he was still an emperor. A moment later, the young lady looked intently at the emperor. She was taken aback and wondered if he was really looking at her right now. A moment later, she was no less surprised than she had been a few minutes ago as he winked at her with a smile. She froze in shock and embarrassment and wondered if he had just winked at her. She was sure that the emperor was just a weirdo because she didn't understand why he did that. But the emperor was unwavering and confident. She was shocked and wondered if he was waving his hand at her. She was taken aback because she saw the prince and wondered if it was her old friend Didi, even though his hair color was different. She was shocked and did not understand why he was here. She was frozen in shock and couldn't do anything. She didn't even respond when the young lady said that it was time for her to go. She wondered if it was possible that his life had been threatened before he met Arya. In the original, if he was the crown prince, she remembered his ring because it was the source of the magic that hid his appearance. Crown Prince Diego Elias de Helios Salatin was a candidate for the role of the novel's protagonist. He was the son of the deceased empress and was crown prince from birth. However, when he was 5 years old, Tina Caprose became empress and began to threaten the life of the young prince. She did everything to raise her own son, the second prince, as heir to the throne. Kashmir knew very well that the emperor loved his son very much, but could not openly defend him. The reason was a long-standing tradition of the Imperial family, because the emperor could not participate in a bloody feud touch. For this reason, Diego had to survive many assassination attempts, despite the fact that he was the crown prince. In the original, young Arya saved the crown prince. The moment of contact between the main character and the prince occurred when she healed him, because then he lost consciousness after a raid by mercenaries. Kashmir was in shock because she understood that everything was very bad, because they never met. Because the young lady protected the young prince, he was unable to meet their main character. She was in shock because she saved the prince. She knew that she couldn't have known that it was him because the young prince changed his hair color. She, without realizing it, destroyed the original story in one moment. She was shocked because small details were not mentioned in the novel. She hoped that he wouldn't recognize her because she was wearing a mask then. She understood that most likely he wouldn't recognize her, but still her head was filled with such thoughts, and she accidentally staggered. A moment later, she asked the young man for forgiveness. She was in shock because she did not understand what was wrong with her. Liner looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to see. She was no less shocked, as she did not understand why she ran into him. A moment later, she asked for forgiveness and said that it was time for her to go, and with the speed of lightning, she ran away from him. The Liner was taken aback and reached out to her to stop her, but it was all in vain. She ran wherever her eyes looked, because she was puzzled, since she understood that at this rate she would meet the entire harem. But she sighed heavily when she ran out into the corridor. Kashmir understood that now she had to be quiet as a mouse and lower than grass. She didn't want to run into anyone else. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone's voice. The young man smiled and asked if she was bored alone. She understood who was in front of her as she caught the scent of lilies and saw a white cloak. He smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He asked for forgiveness with a smile, because now he had to call her a little differently. A moment later, she was hired and her face changed, and she looked at him with cold fury. He smiled and said that she didn't need to worry, as he would definitely keep her secret and wouldn't call her Mira the mercenary. Kashmir looked at the young man intently and asked how she could trust him. He hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. But after a few seconds, he approached her and, stroking her face, with a gentle smile, said that they were friends, and friends trust each other. She looked at him intently and said that it was not just about friendship. Kashmir was furious and knew that she was losing her temper. He looked at her intently and asked what he could do to make her believe him. El looked tenderly at his companion and said that he would do anything to earn her trust. Kashmir asked the young man if he could swear by the sun. He said with a smile that if she wanted it, he would do it. She was taken aback, as she didn't expect him to agree so quickly. But a moment later, with the speed of lightning, she jerked her hands. As she was leaving, she said that he shouldn't do it. She said that he agreed so easily, as if he didn't know what it meant. Elle in turn said that of course he knew what it meant. She was surprised that he knew and agreed so easily. The sun oath is a posthumous oath before the sun god, which is carried out by a preacher, and whoever dared to break the oath could die immediately. Kashmir looked at the young man intently and asked him what he wanted from her. He smiled tenderly and said that there was one thing he would like to have. She said that in that case, he should tell her what it was, and she would do everything she could to get it. Without looking at the young man, she said that first, he must make an oath to the sun that he would not tell anyone that she was the one of the world, the black mercenary. He smiled and said that he would do whatever she wanted. A moment later, the young man looked intently at his companion and swore an oath to her. Kashmir looked at the young man closely and also took an oath. She understood that if people found out that she was a mercenary, the entire continent would be in an uproar with this news. She understood that she should not involve the Duke in dirty rumors because of her past. She understood that this information would one day become known to the whole world, but she did not want it to be now. Elle looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and swore to her. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that now he must tell her what he so desperately wanted. Looking into the distance, he said sadly that she loved many. He looked at her intently and asked if it was okay if he was one of many. He looked her straight in the eyes and asked her to love him too. Kashmir froze in place in shock and surprise. She was puzzled, as she again felt the scent of lily, and the unhappy look combined with a smile. Every time she saw that look, she thought of that little boy with that same look. She was puzzled, because she realized that the young man was very similar to that child. A moment later, they were told that the blessing ceremony was about to begin. Elle looked at the young lady with a smile, and, as he left, said that they would see each other later. She looked after him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what kind of expression she had just seen on his face. Arya, in turn, ran in a hurry to her sister, as she looked for her everywhere, but could not find her anywhere. Arya quickly grabbed her sister's arm and said that she was very worried because the blessing was about to begin. A moment later, the priest looked closely at the young ladies and asked them to come forward. A few seconds later, the lovely ladies were kneeling before the priest. He looked at them intently and asked with admiration if she really was Kashmir. He said with a joyful smile that he was very glad to meet her, since she was the one who made the epileptic despot, Sweet Macaroon, so he really wanted to meet her as soon as possible. The priest sighed heavily and said that his eyes were rolling back from his grumbling. And, by the way, he was much higher in status than him. He said that the man did not deserve her. She looked at him in bewilderment, because she did not understand what he was talking about. The young priest came closer to the young lady and said that the guy was going crazy when he looked at her. Kashmir looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand who he was talking about. The priest sighed heavily and, looking away, said that the young man had a bad character. If he continued, then he could most likely say goodbye to his position. They looked at him in bewilderment, because they did not understand where he was looking so intently. The young lady turned around to see where the priest was staring so intently. She looked into the crowd in surprise and saw Elle. The priest, with suppressed rage, looked at the young man and said that he was just a hypocrite. Arya looked at the preacher with bewilderment and asked if he really would not bless them. Gritting his teeth, he said that, of course, he would do it. He was just a little distracted and therefore asked for forgiveness. A moment later, he introduced himself and said that he was the chief preacher of the Temple of the Sun, and if they needed help from the temple, they could contact him at any time. Arya just looked at her sister and said that he was really crazy. After a few minutes, he began to read a prayer. After a short prayer, he blessed them. Looking into the hall, he wished everyone present a peaceful life. Everyone rejoiced, with his blessing. The young priest looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she should not forget, because if she needed help, he could help her. Arya looked sideways at her sister and asked what was wrong with the young man. And she also wanted to know if her sister and the young priest knew each other. Kashmir categorically said that she did not know him. A moment later, the young lady looked at her sister and, with a smile, invited her to dance. But before they could take a step, the young aristocrats were all over them, as they were very eager to dance with Lady Arya. Kashmir looked at her sister with a joyful smile, as she understood that she deserved a lot of attention. She wished her a good dance and left. Kashmir walked slowly to the table and took one glass of champagne. She knew that she should dance once, because if no one invited her, everyone would start gossiping. She wondered if she should invite someone first. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. Turning around, she saw men's shoes, and there were several of them. The young men looked at the young lady intently and asked if she would give them one dance. Kashmir was taken aback and froze in shock, as she understood that this was just madness. Lena and Diego were inviting her to dance at the same time. She was taken aback and wondered why they were both asking her to dance. The prince glanced sideways at the young man and said with a grin that he was very glad to see him, and he also asked if there were any problems with his knights. The liner bowed to the prince and greeted him and said that thanks to his care, everything was going well. She was shocked because she saw that they didn't want to address her by name. She wondered if they knew that she was a mercenary, but she knew that she couldn't draw any conclusions yet. But she still wondered if that was not the case. Why didn't they address her by name? She stood quietly looking at the young people, as she did not know what to do. But at the same time she heard everyone else whispering, as everyone was wondering who she would choose. But still, they noticed that they had a love triangle. She was in shock, because she knew that she still had to dance at least once. But the problem for the young lady was that, unfortunately, she did not know who to choose. A moment later, a young man approached them and said with a smile that while it was not too late, he would join too. Elle looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and asked if she would like to dance with him. Liner looked at the priest in surprise, but he told him to be quiet. Kashmir looked closely at the young man and wondered if it wasn't strange that the Holy Father himself decided to be active at the ball. Everyone present whispered, as they didn't know who was in front of them, because they saw that he was wearing a cloak and a mask. Kashmir knew perfectly well that if she refused everyone, it would not be very good, and later she would hear how rude she was. After a few seconds, she finally made up her mind and chose the young man. Elle looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and thanked her. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed he had been rejected. He said that she had only recently become a lady, and he wanted to know what kind of person she was, and he also wanted to know how good she was at dancing. Bowing, the young lady said that she was not very experienced, and she was worried that she would cause him trouble. She asked for forgiveness, and said that if he forgave her, then the next time they met, she would invite him herself. The prince smiled and said that he would wait for that moment. The liner bowed and asked her to do him the honor of dancing with her next time. She froze for a moment as she saw his puppy dog eyes. Kashmir was puzzled, because now it seemed to her that she had done something bad. She looked closely at the young man and said that next time she would invite him. He smiled and said that he would definitely wait. Sometime later, the young people were dancing and watching everyone closely. Diego and Lena, the most eligible bachelors in the Empire, a crowd of admirers gathered around them, and if she chose one of them, it would seem as if she was turning down the other, as a result of which she would make enemies among the crowd. She knew that the best option was to refuse both of them. Elle, leading her onto the dance floor, said that he didn't even think that she would accept his invitation. She smiled and said that it seemed to her that dancing with him would cause the least amount of noise. He smiled and said that he was sure that would be exactly the case. Kashmir looked at him in surprise and asked why he came here. Elle smiled and said that of course he came to see her directly. She asked since when he knew that she was now Kashmir Chris. He smiled and said that perhaps he knew it before she realized it herself. He smiled and said that she shouldn't be scared, because he had just made a lucky guess, and he wasn't sure either, so he still couldn't bring himself to ask her. She was shocked because he was now speaking as if he was reflecting on the past. He told her that the Duke had found the girl and the little girl 18 years ago. They assumed that one of them was his daughter, but from his mistress. This is a truth that many people don't know, but people with red eyes can only be from the Chris lineage. He smiled and said that she was also born with a talent for swordsmanship that was passed down from generation to generation, just like the other heirs who also had a unique sword skill. But of course, this was just his guess. She froze for a moment as she realized that this was not mentioned in the original. She wondered if it was normal that the story of the appearance of a one-time villain was not that important to the story. She knew that the Duke had said before that he had looked for her on his own initiative. She wondered if she had been born by accident. Elle looked closely at his companion and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry. A few seconds later, he twirled her around in a dance. The young lady, in turn, was stunned, as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled and pulled her towards him, quietly saying that he wouldn't tell anyone, because he was very glad that she, Mira, turned out to be Kashmir Chris. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was so happy about it. He came even closer to her and quietly said that now that she was not hiding behind a mask, he could look at her as much as his heart desired. She bowed and looked at the young man and said that it was very surprising, because he had this information. He predicted that she would become Lady Chris. He smiled and said that she was much more outstanding than she thought. Él sonrió y dijo que, para ser honesto, vino porque tenía algo que decirle. He asked if she knew that representatives from Arya were coming. He said that the king's coronation had taken place a few days ago, and so he asked them to be wary of them. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about, and also asked if there were any problems with the representatives of the kingdom. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps there would be one crazy person among them. He asked her not to talk to him under any circumstances, because it would only harm her. He smiled and said that if something was stuck, she should tear it off, and if she couldn't destroy it, because due to diplomatic problems he would be annoying, Elle said that the Duke would finish the job, and he would help. She didn't understand what kind of person he was talking about, but he couldn't tell her. Elle looked at his companion intently and said that there was one thing that she would notice as soon as she saw him, but she should not pay attention to it. She knew that a major incident had occurred in the original and behind the delegation from the kingdom, and after her companion's words, she no longer had any doubts about it. Kashmir looked at the young man closely and said that she understood him. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for spending time with him. She smiled and said that he didn't need to thank her, because it was an honor for her. A moment later, he called her, and at the same time called her by an affectionate nickname. She was taken aback, because she did not understand how he knew such a thing. Elle said with a gentle smile that the next time they met, he would look different, so she shouldn't be scared, but he would always address her the same way. Kashmir stared after the young man, but a moment later, she turned her gaze to a small hair that was on her chest. She froze for a moment in surprise as she noticed the sky-blue hair, but she knew that there was no other person in the entire world with that hair color. She was taken aback and turned around, looking for the young man, but noticed that he was not there. Kashmir was excited, because she did not know who her companion really was. The following month, Carton greeted the young lady with a joyful smile. Kashmir, in turn, looked at us intently, Madame, with a satisfied smile. Madame screamed with joy, as the decorative chains and harnesses were a great success in all the ateliers, and it was all thanks to the young lady. She shouted that they had also become popular among men, and that there were now more orders from young people. Madame told the young lady that she seemed to know that they would achieve such heights. She did not understand where the young lady could have gotten such a great idea. Kashmir looked away from Madame in embarrassment and said that she was exaggerating. She was glad that her modeling family helped her promote the brand. Her sister's debut was very successful, and after the event, she was inundated with letters. Kashmir was very happy as the income exceeded her expectations. She was glad that her sister became the business deputy, but in turn, the young lady was alarmed, for she knew that something did not add up. Ella's blue hair made her uneasy, and she wondered who the young man really was. Some time later, the priest greeted the lady with a joyful smile, saying that her invitation was a great honor for him. He said with a smile that this was their first meeting since the Debutant ball, and he also asked how she had lived all this time. She smiled and thanked him for his concern and said that she was fine. He chatted with her non-stop for some time. Carl looked at his sister and said that this madman was not so terrible. Arya asked her sister if she really liked the priest so much that she continued to listen to his nonsense. She laughed and puzzledly told her family that she didn't like him at all. They said that they didn't like him either. She smiled and told the Holy Father that they should go inside. He said with a smile that of course he would take them inside now, since he had delayed them a little. Kashmir invited Julian to take the sun oath on the day she discovered she was the Duke's daughter. The knights and servants discovered she was a mercenary. She knew she had many enemies. The Duke and the Duke's loyal servants did not want her and her family to be in danger because she was a mercenary, so they all agreed to keep the secret by taking an oath of the sun. The Holy Father looked at her intently and said that he still couldn't believe that she was a disaster swordsman. He looked at her intently and said that he was in such shock right now that his appetite had simply disappeared. For the oath, she told the truth, but she was calm. From the beginning of the Debutant ball, he spoke as if he knew something else about her. She saw that his pretense was very suspicious, as if he did it on purpose. She raised that she needed to know about everything in more detail. Sometime later, all the servants took the oath. The Holy Father said with a joyful smile that they were able to carry out the oath with a large number of people because he was great. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that he had worked hard, so he would send the reward personally. The Holy Father looked at him in surprise and asked how he could expect a reward, and it would be fine if they treated him to a cup of tea. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would like to have tea in her company if she did not mind. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. Arya asked the Holy Father with fury if he thought about what he was saying. Carl asked the Holy Father what kind of nonsense he just said. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at her relatives, asked them to calm down. She slowly approached the Holy Father and, asking for forgiveness, said that she would treat him to tea as an apology. Everyone present was surprised, but did not dare to object to her. Some time later, they were sitting in a small garden. The priest looked at her in surprise and said that he didn't think she would agree. She sighed heavily and said that her relatives had screwed up and she had no choice but to apologize. He smiled and said that he thought there was some other reason for it. He thought that she also had a reason for offering him tea. While sipping tea, he said that she was very smart, and it seemed that she agreed for a certain reason. Kashmir looked at the man intently, as she wanted to ask him everything directly. A moment later, she said that she had an important question. She asked if it was possible to make a false oath. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she meant the oath of the sun that was now on her wrist. He smiled and said that if so, then the oath was true, because one cannot give a false oath of the sun. She was puzzled, because she knew that she shouldn't have asked something so obvious. He was taken aback and asked if she doubted the oath he had sworn. She said that she didn't. The young lady smiled and said that a month ago she had taken an oath for a similar purpose. Now she was wondering whether it was fake or not. He was shocked and said that if she did not trust the pastor who conducted her, then asking him this question was inappropriate. She sighed heavily and asked if she could ask another question. He smiled and said that of course she could ask the question if he could answer it. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew the Holy Father L. The young man was taken aback for a moment and said evasively that this simply couldn't be. But a moment later, he choked on his tea, and trembling with fear, he looked at the young lady and said that he was his old friend, since he had come to the temple before him and had helped him in many ways. Kashmir looked at the Holy Father and asked what kind of person he was. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was grazing him once now. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he had just said. He smiled and said that he had said nothing. A moment later, the Holy Father said that El was very gentle and very kind, not greedy, not hidden, and not at all evil, and he had the character of the sun, God Ra. She looked at him in surprise and asked if the god Ra was not a god with a furious and violent temperament. He looked at her intently, as if she had hit the nail on the head, but looking away from the young lady, he said that it was not true. He said that the young man was a warm and gentle friend, like the sun itself. She smiled and asked if he was a good man. The Holy Father smiled and said that of course he was not. The Holy Father said with an embarrassed smile that a young man cannot forget his first love until he is 20, and he still suffers from being in love. Kashmir looked at him in surprise and asked if that was all. He said with a smile that, of course not, but if she didn't mind, when there was time, he would like to invite her to the temple once. She said it was not difficult, and also asked if there was any reason. He looked at her intently and said that, in their temple, there is one dog who suffers from illnesses every day, because he cannot forget her, and this nasty man who does not have the courage to come here bites the weak. She was surprised and asked if there were really dogs in the temple. He said that it so happened that this dog was the most important person in the temple. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything and would visit them soon. He thanked her with a smile, but a moment later, the young lady said that she would see him out. He smiled and said that she shouldn't do that, because he didn't come to say that. A moment later, he said something quietly to her, and she froze in surprise. She stood there for a while, looking at him in bewilderment, not understanding why he apologized and what he apologized for. Some time later, the young lady was warming up on the training ground. Everyone was watching her closely and whispering to each other, asking if she would really go to battle with their duke. She didn't listen to anyone and continued to warm up. Kashmir looked at the duke in surprise as she asked what battle they were talking about. The duke said that he wanted to test her skills, and a warm-up wouldn't hurt. He asked her what she thought about it. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't mind at all. He looked at her intently and said that, just in case, she should try not to outshine him. She ran away in a way she had not expected. The young people shouted in one voice to their sister not to shake and to do as their father did. He looked at them intently and sighed heavily and said that it seemed he had no need to grow those brats. She smiled and said that he should take care of her. Kashmir was surprised, as she was fighting a swordsman of her own level. She saw that the duke's sword was very fast and sharp. It was restrained and neat, but at the same time elegant. He looked like a normal knight, but he was very unpredictable and abrupt. She understood that his skills lived up to his reputation. She looked at the duke with a fierce grin, as this battle was much more interesting than she had expected. She looked at her father intently, as she did not want to lose to him at all. But at the same time, the young lady saw that he easily repelled all her attacks. Everyone present was shocked, because they could witness such a brutal battle. She dodged his attacks with ease. Kashmir did not lose her nerve and dealt him blow after blow. The duke looked at his daughter with a satisfied smile and said that she had exceeded his expectations, but she paid no attention to his words and continued the battle. She looked at her father intently and said that they could stop with the childish jokes already. She knew that a swordsman's experience could be judged by the length of his hair, as it could hinder the battle. Her loose hair showed that she was strong enough, and they proved that Vo was no obstacle to her in battle. He looked at her with a grin, as this was an open provocation on her part. A moment later, he looked at her with a fierce grin and said that he thought he was wrong about his daughter. It took her a long time for the fight to reach such a magnificent level that no one in the audience had ever seen. Perhaps it was due to the excitement of the swordsmen who were facing an opponent in a fight for the first time in a long time. Although she was also losing in skill and physical strength, the battle was not over yet. The duke, fighting with his daughter, shouted at her to hold her ground. She noticed that the duke was prolonging the pleasure. Kashmir did nothing but attack. But the duke, who could hurt her, but she could not hurt him, only dodged. She was puzzled, did not understand why he did this. She did not understand why all these useless movements. She wondered why he was so hesitant. She understood that he knew that there was mana coming from her body that was protecting her, so even if he attacked, the wound would be minor. In such a fight, due to lack of stamina, she would lose first. But she wanted to win so much. She understood that she had no other choice, and she had to finish the fight using this method. The way she confronted the entities she could not cope with. She looked closely at the duke, as she understood that everything was going according to her plan, and she must now strike him. The duke was taken aback and froze. Looking at his daughter, he shouted for her to stop, but she had no intention of doing so. A moment later, he froze in shock on the spot, but at the same time her sword was at his throat, but he didn't care at all, because he saw that he had hurt his daughter. She looked at him intently while the duke stood there, dumbfounded. She said with a joyful smile that she had won the fight. A moment later, she looked into the distance as she saw her sister running at full speed towards her, and she happily said that she had won. But Arya ran up to the Duke and shouted that he was just a crazy bastard. But at the same time, she slapped him in the face with fury. The Duke was shocked and could not do anything. Kashmir was shocked by her sister's actions and did not understand what all the fuss was about. She saw that everyone was running towards her. She turned around, looking at her brother, and said that she had won. He was shocked and screamed, "Had she gone crazy?" She looked at him in bewilderment and said that she had done it and won. He was screaming that winning didn't matter because she was hurt. He was furious and asking if she hadn't heard them telling her to stop and stop. He was saying that they didn't care whether she won or lost. She said, shaking, that she hadn't heard. She just really wanted to win. But a moment later, she looked up and froze as her sister flew towards her with a threatening expression on her face. Some time later, the young lady sat in the medical room with a stunned face. Arya, bursting into tears, hugged her sister and asked why she didn't listen to her, because she was screaming and begging her to stop. Arya asked her sister with tears in her eyes if this was the reason she always returned home in such a state. The young lady sighed heavily and apologized for her sister because she did not listen and was in a hurry. She said that, unfortunately, she was not trained to handle the ball properly and only knew how to attack. But a moment later, the young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment, for she saw that someone had lifted her up like a feather and seated her next to her. She looked at the Duke in bewilderment for a moment, after which he hugged her tightly. The Duke, hugging his daughter, said that she should not allow him to hurt her. Kashmir was very confused and surprised by his behavior. He sighed heavily and said that he did not want to see injuries on her body anymore. He shouted that in case of danger, she should not attack, but should defend herself. The Duke sighed heavily and asked what she was thinking. He said he would let her win 100 times, but he asked only one thing, that she not get hurt. She looked closely at her father, who was hugging her, as she now understood why he was angry after all, and everyone else. She realized that they loved her. In response, the young lady hugged her father tightly and barely held back her tears, but she still agreed with him. A moment later, the young lady healed her sister with her power. Kashmir noticed that, unlike the divine power, there was a soft light emanating from it. When the main character learned that she was half fairy, she began to develop healing abilities. Now she could easily heal small wounds. A moment later, Kashmir looked at her sister in surprise. Arya, with tears in her eyes, spoke of her sister, that she had done everything. Kashmir looked at her sister intently and hugged her, asking for forgiveness, because it was her fault. Arya continued to cry and asked her sister not to do that again, and also told her to never sacrifice her health. Kashmir noticed that not only her father, but everyone who was around her loved her. She was puzzled and wondered why she hadn't realized this before, because now she realized that in some way she was a happy person. Sometime later, the Duke informed the young daughters that an invitation to the palace had arrived in the morning. Kashmir asked her father in surprise if something had happened. The Duke looked at them intently and said that the Emperor wanted to see them. The young ladies were taken aback with surprise. The Duke said that he had been postponing their visit as long as he could, saying that they were not yet ready, but unfortunately, the time had already come, and so he asked their forgiveness, because the Emperor was simply burning with black curiosity. He looked at the girls intently and said that they should not interest him in anything. The Duke said that the Emperor showed a very keen interest in them, although to be honest, all they did was to attract his attention. He sighed heavily and said that they had to be careful so that nothing happened. Kashmir looked closely at her father, as she could see that even he was worried. She knew that the Emperor had been very provocative at the ball. In the original, the main character was an interesting figure, because she encouraged the Emperor's wife. Kashmir was puzzled and did not understand how she was interesting to the Emperor, but she was also interested in what kind of person the Empress was. Kashmir was very sorry that the Duke was worried about them, although she was worried. But for their happy future, it was necessary. He sighed heavily and said that he really hoped that everything would go well, but they still had to prepare. He looked at them intently and said that today they would quickly visit the palace and quickly leave. The young ladies looked at him in bewilderment. Kashmir was taken aback for a moment and froze. She understood that since they were visiting the emperor, the crown prince would also be there. She was taken aback, because she didn't want to meet him at all. Trembling with fear, she looked at her father and asked if His Highness the Crown Prince would be at the meeting. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and said that it was true. Arya looked at her sister in confusion and asked if the prince had really embarrassed her at the ball with that invitation to dance. She sighed heavily and said that it was not that at all. The Duke looked at his daughter in surprise and asked if the prince had really asked her to dance. She sighed heavily and said that he had. Arya didn't give her sister a chance to say a word. She shouted to the Duke that the prince was looking at her as if he had fallen in love. They discussed the prince among themselves for some time, and the young lady told the Duke about all the young men who had asked her sister to dance. A moment later, the palace, where he walked into the hall and told them that the Imperial carriage had arrived. The Duke sighed heavily and said in a puzzled tone that he saw that the Emperor was not changing his impatience. Sometime later, they all arrived at the Imperial palace. The Emperor greeted them with a smile, and they, according to the rules of etiquette, greeted him in return. Kashmir looked closely at the Emperor, for she saw that his youth had not gone away. She knew that he was a man who was already nearly 50 years old, and yet he had the appearance of a young man. But even up close, if one gave him less than 30, he looked very good. Kashmir knew perfectly well that she should be nervous under such pressure, but she was different, and she should not bow down when meeting such a man. The Emperor looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was the one who had rejected his son. Kashmir was taken aback and froze in shock, as she felt very awkward. He looked closely at the young ladies and said that they had made a fuss in high society as soon as they entered it, and now they had begun to sell belts and chains as accessories. The Emperor looked at them with a smile and said that the duller props were the most popular accessories now, and they could not even imagine how much they favored the fact that without them it was impossible to be in trend. He said that he heard that they had captured high society. The lady was puzzled, because she saw that the Emperor was very cheerful, and his mouth did not close. And now she understood the Duke, because the Emperor reminded her of someone. A moment later, they passed him in a small living room, enjoying tea, while the Emperor, smiling, had a casual conversation with Arya. Kashmir looked at the prince intently and wondered if he wanted to kill her with his gaze. Kashmir sighed heavily and looked away from him, as this was burdening her. She did not understand why he looked at her like that. She knew that at the ball he looked at her just as aggressively. Kashmir looked at him intently, taken aback, wondering if he had actually found out who she really was. She was suddenly flooded with memories of how they slept in the same bed, hugging each other. She was in shock, because just the thought of it made her want to die. She knew that the young man who had been stabbed in the alley was most likely the crown prince. Kashmir was shocked, because she could not have thought at all that it was the same person.